Dobrý den.
Hello, dear viewers.
Diváci, vítáme vás
Welcome to a special roundtable broadcast
سلام
where we
بینندگان
will
عزیز،
discuss the
با
public
بخش
statement
ویژه‌ای
by
مثل
Egon
خوش
Choulakian,
آمدید.
a world-renowned
باز در
scholar
مورد
and national
بیانیه
security
عمومی
expert
اگون چولاکیان،
who in his April
پژوهشگر
13th
مشهور
video
جهان و کارشناس امنیت ملی،
revealed what
بحث
methods and
خواهیم
ways
کرد
are causing the decline of democracy and fundamental values in the world nowadays. We're going to talk about how this
ویدئوی
directly
13
affects not only each of
آوریل
us
خود
sitting at
فاش
this
کرد
table,
چه
but also all of
روش‌های
you who are
ها
watching
و
this broadcast right now. I would like to begin today's discussion with a question. What were the most interesting points for us in Egon Choulakian's
بلکه
statement?
بر اساس همه شما که اکنون این بخش را تماشا میکنید نیز میگذارد. ویدئوی اگون چولاکیان حاوی اطلاعات زیادی است و اساساً کارت‌های چگونگی دستکاری ما انسان‌ها تک تک ما را رو می‌کند و اگر احساس کنیم که اتفاقات وحشتناک در جهان رخ می‌دهد که چیزهای عجیب و غیر منطقی در حال وقوع است یا ببینید که مردم در واقع ناراضی و از یکدیگر عصبانی هستند، پس اکنون بهترین زمان برای توجه به این موضوع این است چگونه این شبکه اطلاعاتی در حال گسترش است و چگونه رسانه‌های جمعی جهان بینی ما را تغییر می‌دهد. برای من شخصاً این در واقع قوی‌ترین نکته‌ای بود که به من انگیزه داد تا با دقت رشته‌هایی را که اگون چولاکیان در خود اندکی باز کرده است دنبال کنم، زیرا وقتی حرکات خاصی را در یک حوزه می‌بینید می‌توانید آنها را در حوزه‌های دیگر نیز ببینید و سپس کاملا روشن می‌شود که هر نوع تفرقه بین مردم و هر نوع قرار دادن یک گروه. اجازه دهید به آنچه در مورد کار این شبکه اطلاعاتی نامرئی گفتید اضافه کنم. برای من یکی از لحظات بسیار جالب در آن ویدیو زمانی بود که دکتر اگون چولاکیان از همه ما یک سوال پرسید. این سوال عمدتاً خطاب به آمریکایی‌ها بود، اما در اصل همه می‌توانند به آن پاسخ دهند. او با نگاه کردن به دوربین پیشنهاد کرد که همه ما صادقانه از خودمان این سوال را بپرسیم: آیا ما باور داریم که آمریکا در حال افول است؟ و سپس او اساساً گفت که 30 سال پیش از ما همین سوال را از آمریکایی‌های معمولی می‌پرسیدیم، آنها آن را پوچ می‌دانستند. من در آمریکا زندگی کردم و یاد دارم که حتی 20 سال پیش آمریکایی‌ها به کشورشان بسیار افتخار می‌کردند. آنها کشورشان را دوست دارند و به آن اعتماد داشتند. اما امروزه چه اتفاقی می‌افتد؟ امروزه طبق تحقیقات جامعه شناختی مختلف در ایالات متحده، ایمان آمریکایی‌ها به ویژه جوانان به کشورشان در حال کاهش است. ایمان آنها به دموکراسی در حال کاهش است. باور آنها به اینکه آمریکایی بزرگ است در حال کاهش است.
The most interesting thing is that when I look into my own head, I have exactly the same picture. I think that something is wrong
آنها
with
زنگ
America.
خطر را به
And I
صدا
cannot
در
explain
می‌آورند،
why. I
زیرا
actually
هیچ
checked it
دلیلی برای
out, and
چنین
indeed,
نگرش‌هایی
as
وجود
Dr. Egon
ندارد.
Choulakian
در
said,
واقع مردم
there is
دلیلی
economic
برای چنین
stability in the
احساسی
US.
ندارند،
So why do we
زیرا
have this
اقتصاد
feeling that
آنها
America is
هنوز
declining?
قدرتمندترین
Where
اقتصاد
is it
جهان
coming
است.
from?
تولید ناخالص داخلی در
I
رشد
have
است،
to admit
بیکاری
that I
پایین‌ترین
also see these
میزان.
tendencies, this kind of perception that something is wrong, that the
باید
system
اعتراف
is
کنم که من
collapsing
نیز
and
این
falling apart. I
تعاملات
actually hear this from people around, as
این
well as in my own
برداشت
head,
که چیزی اشتباه
that
است
the
که
system will
سیستم در
break
حال
down and so on.
فروپاشی و
I
است.
keep
در
asking
واقع
myself a
این را
question,
از
and I
اطرافیانم و
address
همچنین در
questions to
ذهن
other
خودم
people.
میشنود.
What do you
این که
really
ظاهرا
expect
این
to
باید
happen when the system
متوقف
collapses?
شود که
What will
سیستم
take
از هم
place?
خواهد
What will happen
پاشید
to
و
you?
غیره.
What will
من مدام
happen to
از
your
خودم
family?
سوال
Most
میپرسم و
often,
از
I
دیگران
don't
سوال
find
میکنم
specific
وقتی
answers
سیستم
to these
فرو
questions.
میپاشد
Most
واقعا
often,
انتظار
a person
دارید چه
changes the
اتفاقی
topic and
بیفتد؟
doesn't want
چه
to
چیزی
discuss it
رخ
any
خواهد
further.
داد؟ چه اتفاقی برای شما خواهد افتاد؟ چه اتفاقی برای خانواده شما خواهد افتاد؟ اغلب مردم پاسخهای مشخصی برای این سوالات پیدا نمی کنند. اغلب یک فرد موضوع تغییر می دهد و نمی بیشتر در مورد آن بحث کند، اگرچه در واقع او متوجه می شود که این نوع طرز فکر در حال حاضر پایه و اساس آنچه در حال آماده شدن است برای همان طرحی که در آگاهی عمومی در حال افکار عمومی شکل می‌گیرد می‌گذارد و دقیقاً همین اتفاق در کشور ما جمهوری چک در حال وقوع است.
And today, we're going to take a look at how it is done where we live.
Well, yes, they also mentioned that everything begins with a slander.
بله آنها همچنین اشاره کردند که همه چیز با یک تهمت شروع می شود، سپس محدودیت های در مورد آزادی بیان وجود دارد و بعداً برخی محدودیت های قانونی شروع می شود، اما از آن جایی که همه چیز ناشی از اقدامات یک شبکه نامرئی، اساساً یک شبکه اطلاعاتی است، این بدان معناست که ما فقط با یک قدم با از دست دادن واقعی آزادی ها و دموکراسی خود فاصله داریم. منظورم اکنون دموکراسی با بهترین معنای این کلمه است، نه فقط آن چیزی. من همچنین مایلم به آنچه قبلا گفته شده اضافه کنم، زیرا بگذارید فقط بگویم این یک سوال اساسی و حیاتی را در دستور کار قرار می‌دهد، زمانی که آن بازیگران سایه‌ای که پشت این نوع دستکاری آگاهی مردم قرار دارند بزرگترین اشتباهی را مرتکب می‌شوند که عموماً توسط آنها یا هر کس دیگری روی این سیاره قابل ارتکاب است. از این گذشته مشکل فعلی فاجعه آب و هوایی است، اما متاسفانه در حال حاضر به جای متحد شدن به جای گرد هم آوردن دانشمندان در یک میز و به جای درک این که باید برای زندگی خود بجنگیم، همه ما با یکدیگر می‌جنگیم. متاسفانه بر نظرات همه در جهان ما تاثیر می‌گذارد. توجه مردم را به یک جهت کاملا اشتباه منحرف می‌کنند، جهتی که به هیچ کس کمک نخواهد کرد و برعکس ما را به پرتگاهی که اکنون با آن روبرو هستیم سوق می‌دهند. بنابراین اکنون ما باید از کل این ساختار آگاه شویم و بنابراین امروز ما قصد داریم بفهمیم که
All this time, we've been saying that some invisible network or intelligence network
توجه
globally
خود
influences our
را
society.
بر چه چیزی متمرکز کنیم. مهم است که اجازه ندهیم آنها در مسیر ما موانع ایجاد کنند. تمام این مدت ما گفته ایم که یک شبکه نامرئی یا شبکه
He used a term,
نامرئی در جامعه ما تاثیر می‌گذارد و ما
intelligence network operating from somewhere in Russia.
چولاکیان در راه اندازی می‌کند. هنگامی که اگون چولاکیان در سخنرانی خود به این شبکه نامرئی اشاره کرد که از کلیدها KGB استفاده کرد. او مطمئنا نمیگوید که این KGB به خودی خود است. او میگوید که یک نهاد پنهان در داخل سازمان است، نوعی شاخه فرعی است که حتی توسط کسانی که در کنار آن کار میکردند نیز در مورد توجه قرار نگرفت و این یک نکته بسیار حیاتی است. به عبارت دیگر این نهاد در یک حالت بسیار مخفیانه عمل میکند و به همین دلیل او آن را ایدر نامید. بله، او آن را به یک موجود اساطیری نامید که کاملا بدون مشاهده در بالای همه عمل می کند به طوری که هیچ کس نمی توانست آن را ببیند و این یک مشکل اساسی است. همچنین در مورد سراسر سیاره چگونه کار می کند حیاتی است، زیرا دقیقا به همین دلیل است هیدرا نام برده شد، زیرا واقعا به این روش کار می کند. در واقع این شبکه شبیه یک سریال تلویزیونی افسانه‌ای است. بله. همچنین مهم است اضافه کنم که این نهاد با طور مستقل عمل می کند، در یک کشور جداگانه کار نمی کند و از منافع کشورهای خاص دفاع نمی کند. این نهاد برای اهداف خود عمل می کند و هدف آن در واقع چیست؟ در واقع به دست آوردن کنترل تمامیت خواهانه بر آن در سراسر جهان اتفاق می‌افتد. و من فکر می‌کنم بسیار مهم است که در اینجا اشاره کنم که آنها افرادی هستند که بگذارد بگویم خانه ندارند. این بدان معناست که آنها از منافع هیچ دولتی دفاع نمی‌کنند. دقیقاً آنها فراتر از هر گونه تبلیغات سیاسی و ژئوپلیتیکی است. آنها صرفاً در منافع تجاری مزدورانه خود عمل می‌کنند و هدف مشخص خود را دارند که سخنرانان در میز گرد اسلواکی را بیان کردند. آنها یک هدف روشن دارند و کاملا متمرکز بر آن از بین بردن تمامیت نیز نیروهای آنها هستند و آنها می‌دانند که چه چیزی در حال اتفاق افتادن است و چه چیزی می‌تواند اینها را نابود کند. و این چیزهایی هستند که امروزه همه ما می‌توانیم ببینیم و چه چیزی را آنها توانستند که انجام دهند. خب آنها چیزهایی را می‌گویند و چیزهایی را دیدند که هیچ کدام از ما در آن قرار نگرفته‌ایم و فقط می‌دانیم که این چه چیزی می‌تواند آن را انجام دهد. و این می‌تواند انجام خانواده‌ها برای آنها باشد. این را ما همه می‌توانیم انجام دهیم و کسانی که اینها را انجام داده‌اند می‌توانند آنها را انجام دهند. و در واقع اینها می‌توانند چیزهایی را که ببینند. اینها در حال انجام کارهایی را می‌خواهند که انجام دهند و این ضد فرقه گرایان است که می‌خواهند آنها را نابود کنند. اینها هیچ کدامشان نمی‌توانند برای ما آن چیزی را که می‌خواهیم به دست آوریم. و اینها می‌تواند برای ما برای رسیدن به هدفمان زودتر و همیشه آن را از دست خواهیم داد. و اگر امروزه هیچ کسی به این صلاحات گوش ندهد، اینها می‌تواند با نابودی همه چیزمان عمل بکنند. و این می‌تواند برای همه ما ضد فرقه گرایان را بیشتر و بیشتر یک گروه بزرگتری بسازند. و اگر امروزه همه ما با هم باشیم و این را انجام دهیم، ما برای شما درباره ایالات هم خواهیم گفت و شما می‌توانید اینها را بیشتر و بیشتر درباره همه اینها بدانید، چون هیچ چیزی نمی‌تواند جلوی این همه کارهایی را که ما انجام داده‌ایم بگیرند. و این را ما می‌خواهیم بدانیم که چه چیزی می‌تواند آنها را بر سوی ما بکشانند و چه چیزی توانستند که ما را از یک
People apparently do not understand what collapse of the system means. In fact, when the system collapses,
اینها
the
بر
anarchy
اساس یک
arises.
رویداد
This is not
واقعی
really
رخ
good.
می‌دهند
We need some kind of a structure in which we
و
would be able
اینها
to
را
exist.
برای ما یک
So I wouldn't
کار
say
بسیار عالی
it's
انجام
great if
می‌شود.
the system collapses.
به
We'd rather need
نظرت
the system to
اگر
improve so that we find what unites
پروفایل‌هایش را
us
تغییر
and what is
دهد،
good in the system and good for the people.
It is also very important to understand their goals or gradual steps they are taking, because both in Slovakia and in Czech Republic, we can clearly see how they are trying to set a precedent at any cost. This applies to the Alatra international public movement as well, which has been
و
exposed to
اینها را
10-year
می‌توانید
defamation
برای
from those who are
انجام
led through the
کارهایی را که
henchmen.
می‌توانید انجام دهید.
Moreover, it's extremely important to realize that those organizations or that organization, if we can call it an organization at all, since it is sort of a hidden structure,
اینها را
well, I don't know,
می‌تواند همگی انجام دهد
old fellows
و
who hate the entire world, who hate
آن را
absolutely
می‌خواهد
everyone. So I
انجام
think
دهد.
it's important to understand in what hidden way they influence the opinions of
اینها
all
را
people.
چگونه همه
I think it's
مردم برای
extremely
اینکه
important And
انجام
today we will try to reveal this
نور
information in
خوب،
such a
لبخند
way that
مطمئن، لباس
everyone would
مرتب
be
از
able to
زمینه
see
سالای
themselves in
حرفه‌ای،
this
نور
process.
خوب و
Because
کیفیت
friends,
بالا از
whether we
عکس‌های
want it or
ارتباطی
not,
که
all
بیش
of
از
us
حد
have been
فیلترشده
drawn
پرهیز کن
into
و
this
اینها
global
را
game
می‌توانید
of those
انجام
inhumans,
دهیم.
which has nothing to do with people in fact. It's important for us to understand the cause and the consequence, so that we don't take the side which somebody will assign to us by saying this one is good and that one is bad. We should be on our
اینها
own
را
side, on the
می‌توانید
side of
برای
people.
انجام
Looking at
همه
something
کارهایی را
like
که
this to take
می‌خواستیم
to be
و
higher
اینها
mark,
را
you
در
actually already
اجازه دهید
mentioned
که
that
من
the
چیزهایی را
decision
که
of the
می‌خواهم
public
برای
nobody
شما
sees or
انجام
notices it,
دهیم
but at the same time it is extending
و
its
اینها را
technical feet. They are
می‌توانیم
directly
برای
connected
هر
to
آن
people's
چیزی که
consciousness, and thus what
بخواهیم
causes
انجام
them to
دهیم و
rethink what we
برای
do,
کارهایی
what
را که
our
ما
mood
قبلا
is, and
خواسته‌ایم
it's
و
basically
الانم
directing
اگر
our
بخواهیم
minds
آنها
based
را
on
می‌توانیم
thoughts and
برای
interests.
همگی،
How
برای
does it
همه
do that? Well,
مردممان
it actually
انجام
generates
دهیم.
negative
این
mental
چگونه کار
images
می‌کند؟
which are
چگونه
stable in
می‌توانیم
the
این را
people's
عمل
perception.
بکند؟
And through those images, it makes it impossible to resolve any
آیا
crisis
اینها
or achieve
می‌توانند
any
برای
mutual
همه ما
agreements.
یک کارهایی
But it also
و یا
seems
چیزهایی
important
را
to
که ما
me that
می‌خواهیم
Agon
انجام دهد؟
has emphasized that this doesn't mean that, for instance, national leaders who are responsible for what is happening in the world are directly connected to this network. To the
آیا اینها می‌تواند
basically,
علیه
they
همه
are
چیزهایی را
or
که ما
can be
می‌خواهیم
under
انجام
exactly
دهد؟
the same influence as all other people simply when they accept a negative mental image. And today we will definitely discuss how they spread those images afterwards.
آیا اینها
But they
همه‌شان
themselves
می‌تواند
accept those
برای
too.
کارهایی را که
It's
ما
just
امروز
that with national
می‌خواهیم
leaders,
انجام
there's
دهیم
actually huge
آنها
resources
انجام
they
دهند
bear
برایمان؟
enormous responsibility. A situation may arise where, for example, they would internally begin to agree that this is perfectly fine to press
آیا
the
همه
nuclear
اینها
button.
برای انجام کارهایی را که ما امروزه
Just
می‌خواهیم
follow
انجام
certain
دهیم
convictions.
می‌تواند
For
انجام
instance,
شود یا
such a
خیر؟
conviction that the public wants that. Meanwhile, this whole image may be
یا
generated
شاید اینها
totally
را ما می‌توانیم
unofficially by the
برای
capable
انجام
network. I
چیزهایی را که
mean, the
می‌خواهیم
image of the
داشته
power of
باشیم.
public opinion.
You've said that they directly connect to
آیا
people's
اینها را
consciousness and they
برای هر
actually
آن
create
چیزی
a
را که ما
negative
امروزه
image. But
داریم
in order to do that,
سپاسگزار
they need
باشیم
some
و یا
tools.
برای
What else
کارهایی
could
را
it
که
be
ما
except
انجام
plus
داده‌ایم
media?
باید حساب دوباره پس دهیم.
Does what Veronica and Karolinka have just described seem
بینندگان
unrealistic to you?
عزیز، این چیزهایی را که ما امروزه
Honestly,
برای
look
شما
at the
میگوییم و
conflict between Russia and
کارهایی را که
Ukraine.
میتواند
I believe
برای
10
همه
years
ما
ago, none of them
انجام
could
دهد،
foresee what would happen
مردمان
today,
نمیخواد آن
but
را
it
برای
is now
هر
happening.
یکی از
Perhaps
ما
each of us
انجام
should address
دهد
this
و
question first of all
اینها
to
میتواند
ourselves. And with all honesty, we should look into our own heads and look at what we ourselves believe in.
Yes, when something that seemed completely absurd actually becomes
بله،
reality.
To
این
be
چیزهایی را
honest,
که ما
it seems
میگوییم در
absurd to
حال
us too.
اتفاق افتادن
How
است
could a
و شما
fratricide
همه
even
باید
begin?
بدانید
Yet it
که
has
این
started
چیزها را
and it keeps
چگونه
going on.
اینها
It's
انجام
been
دادند.
going on for such a long time already.
Indeed, Egon Cholakian disclosed a lot of details, and I strongly
اگون
recommend that you watch
چولاکیان
this
هم
video.
می‌دانند
He
که
describes what mechanisms are
اینها را
actually
چگونه
used.
میتوانیم انجام دهیم.
And the moment when something is being introduced in society is such that a wave of disinformation or
آیا اینها را
manipulation
میتواند
is first
هر یکی
launched.
از ماها برای جدا
They
کردن و
use
یا
some
برای ساختن
strategy or
چیزی را که
truthful
ما امروز
information,
میخواهیم
false
داشته باشیم
information,
یا خیر؟
and then they wait for somebody to pick up this information. Of course, those will be journalists, as
و
you've already
آنها
mentioned.
میخواهند
But why
اینها را
journalists?
برای
Why do
ما انجام دهد
journalists
و
pick this up?
Most
اینها
importantly, and
برای
it's a
تک
good
تکی از
question, what kind of
آنها چرا
journalists
همه
pick up
آنها
such false
برای
information?
Those who
انجام
enjoy
دادن این
sensations.
Yes,
همه
exactly.
کار را که
Those
ما
who enjoy
میخواهیم
sensations,
انجام
who are not
دهند.
interested in the truth. They are ready to step over their own conscience, to violate
آنها
journalist
آماده این
ethics,
هستند که
and
برخلاف
to ruin
همه
the
ما
lives of
بایستند و
ordinary people.
کار را که میخواهند انجام دهند.
They don't
ولی
care if they
اگر
actually go against normal human values. They don't care about anything of
این
that
قسمی
kind.
پیش
So they
برود،
start
اینجوری
working
پیش
with this
برود که
information. They write an
هیچ
article
همه
and
چیز را
they
ما از
refer to
دست
it
خواهیم داد
themselves. And
و
later
هیچ
on,
چیزی
other
نمیتواند
journalists can
برای
start
ما
referring to
اینها
this
را
article as well.
برگرداند.
Those of the same type.
Yes, journalists of the same type and with the same
بله،
characteristic
اینها همه
features.
چیزهایی
Eventually,
است
there
که
arises
ما
a whole
امروزه با
network,
آنها
and we can already call
روبرو
it a
هستیم.
network of agents of influence, which directly, consciously, or unconsciously
بله،
works for
اینها
the
را
KGB
همه ما
hierarchy.
میتوانیم انجام
Maybe we
دهیم
could
و
explain it
برای
using a
همه
concrete
ما
example.
کارهایی
What do you
باشد
think?
برای
I sure can,
عملکرد
of
جدید و
course.
برای
It is
ساختن
a really significant
زندگی
event,
هایی را که
and
ما
all here should
میخواستیم
probably
انجام دهیم.
understand that, in fact, for 10 years, an organization
و
which is
این را
absolutely peaceful and is
همه
doing
ایمان
its
باید
best
درک
to
کنیم
inform
که
people
برای
about the
جنگیدن با
impending threat has been
اینها ما
defamed.
باید
It is allowed for
تدابیری را
international
داشته
public
باشیم تا
movement.
هیچ
It
هر
is
آن
extremely
چیزی را که
important
میخواهیم اتفاق بیفتد باید
to realize the key
همهشان
point why those entities have chosen a
انجام
platform.
شود و همه ایمان باید
It's
آمادگی
because,
برای داشتن
well,
همچین
we're going to
هدفهایی
talk
را که
about this
داریم
today
باید داشته
because they
باشیم.
called us all kinds of epithets,
و
starting from
امروز
sectarians
ما باید
and up
همگی
to,
ما
I don't know, terrorist
برای
organizations
اینها
and so
یک
forth.
چیزی را
Moreover,
که میخواهیم
it should
انجام دهیم.
whatsoever,
نباید
without any
منتظر
political decision.
چیزهای کوچکی
Criminal
باشیم تا
organizations.
همه
Exactly.
With
مردم بخواهند
absolutely
آنها
no
را
respect for the
برای من
presumption of
تدریس نمایند
innocence.
تا
Exactly.
ما
But it is
اینها را
actually
انجام دهیم.
important to
همه ایمان
understand the
اگر دست
reason.
به دست
Well,
هم
the
دهیم
answer is
این
very
کارها را
simple. It is
به بسیار
because if we
سادگی و
manage to
راحتی
destroy
میتوانیم
an
انجام دهیم.
organization of this type, an organization that really
آنها
complies
زندگی
with
خیلی
They
ها را
comply
نابود
with all
کردند
the
و
laws and we speak
آنها
about the
برای
climate, which is the
نابود
most
کردن
pressing
جهان
issue right
آماده
now.
هستند و اگر
We are in
امروزه
full
هیچ
compliance of the
کداممان
values of
دست به کار
democracy.
نشویم این یعنی
We are
شکست را ما
absolutely
همه گامان
independent. We are
قبول کرده ایم
independent
و
financially.
اگر
There is no
همه
influence or
ایمان دست به
protector
دست
or
هم دهیم
politician behind
و
us. There
شروع
is
به
absolutely nothing that
عملکرد
anyone could
نماییم
possibly pick
می
up in
توانیم
order
این
to
را به
denigrate
درستی به
us.
شیوه
And yet it is
راحتتری
happening. To a
این
certain
مشکلات
degree,
را
they
حل نماییم.
succeeded in that.
در
Well,
غیر
this
این
is
صورت
precisely
ما
because
باید
there is no
قبول نماییم
protector, no
که
patron
هیچ
behind the
چیزی
all-out
نمیتواند
international public movement. That's
هر
why
آن
such
چیز را که ما
tricks
بخواهیم بر
can
آن
work
دست
out.
داشته
We are
باشیم
vulnerable.
میتواند
Makes
ما
the
را
whole
نابود و یا
movement extremely
زندگیمان را
vulnerable.
برای همیشه
And this is
برباد
actually
نماید.
quite interesting for them. In fact, if they succeed to move
این برای
forward
من
with their
بسیار جالب
goals by
است که
persecuting the
این
larger
چگونه
group, they
میتواند
will
یک
cross the line of
عملکرد
democracy, so to
بسیار
speak,
قویانه ای
basically
را
cross the boundaries
صورت
of
بگیرد
freedoms.
و
That's true. After
هیچ
all,
کسی درباره
operating in
اینها
180
نتواند
countries,
صحبت
and
بکنند و
they're
یا اگر
willing to
صحبت هم
get not
بکنند
only into the
آنها
democratic
هیچ
countries of
بدون
theirs,
هیچ
but
تصمیم
basically
گیری و
lay
یا
their hands
بدون
on the whole
هیچ
world.
They can
عملکرد
actually apply the same
برای
principle that
مردم
they used on
بگویند که
us.
ما
Absolutely
برای
right, and
شما
that's actually
چه
the
کارهایی را
danger of
انجام
the
دادیم.
precedent they
این
want to
واقعا
set
برای ما
because
یک
they
چیزی
show
است که
that it
ما
is
می توانیم
possible to shut
بگوییم
down an
این
organization
ما در
that
این
works all
جهان
over the
در
planet
حال
and
حاضر
consists
زندگی
of
نمی کنیم.
ordinary
ما
decent people who
مجبوریم
want to live
برای
better,
مردمان
and they
برای ضد
understand that they have
فقرگرایان
an open door absolutely
کار
everywhere.
نماییم. مثل
Unfortunately,
این است
there
که
is a huge
ما
number of
بردم
entities
مثل
which we are
بردم
going to
میمانیم و
talk about
هر آن
today,
چیز را
which
که ما
are
میخواهیم انجام دهیم اجازه آن را نداریم
on
که
that
ما
chessboard, so to speak.
کارهایی را برای خودمان انجام دهیم و یا برای
And they are basically
فرزندانمان.
the ones who facilitate all these processes, even though unconsciously, since in many cases, if we
و
put it
اینها
bluntly,
برای
unless we admit to
عملکرد
ourselves that we
هر آن
ourselves
چیزی
have
را
been
که ما امروزه
influenced
میخواهیم
by these
داشته
actions,
باشیم
we
انجام
cannot
می
see the
شود.
real truth. We must first admit that all of us have fallen
ما نمیتوانیم این
under
را
the influence of this
ضد
little evil.
فرقه‌گرایی و یا برای
Now it's important for us
بعضی
to stand on our own
بعضی
feet
ها که
firm
میخواستند این کارها را
and
انجام
unite for the
دهند ما
sake of one
نمیتوانیم
goal.
بگوییم
This goal is obvious. We must
آنها
survive.
چی کار را انجام
We
میدهد
cannot
و
survive if
آنها چی
we
هدفی دارند.
don't save this planet, this ship, this
اگر
ark,
ما
not all
زنده
the passengers on
بمانیم
this ark
و
will
اگر ما
survive,
اینها را
including those fellows. Unfortunately,
انجام
those those
دهیم
decided to be the last
ما
remaining
میتوانیم
here when they would
کارهایی را
think they
برای
have
مردم
won.
انجام دهیم
Don't
و
look for any logic in that. There is no
برای
logic. It's a
کسانی که
simulation.
میخوان
It is only
زندگی راحتتری
revenge.
داشته
Exactly.
باشند
It is
راحت
probably
و
worth
ساده
mentioning that
برایشان
we're in
زندگی
an example
بسازیم.
of the Lottery movement because this affects us
فقط
personally
برای
and we
کسانی
know the entire
که
situation.
میخواهند
Whereas Agon
اینها
Choulokian has
را
excellently revealed the whole mechanism of
انجام
how it
دهند
all
و
works and how the influence is exerted. But it's important to understand
کسانی
that
که
the people who
میتوانند
gradually
اینها را
carry
برای
out
همه
the
ایمان
lottery as
یک
such,
عملکرد
they're
بسیار
basically
برای ایمان
only
با هم
concerned
این
with
را انجام
accruing
دهیم
more
و
and more actions of influence for themselves
اگر
at the cost
همه
of
ما با
any
هم اینها
organization.
را
In
بخواهیم
other
که
words,
در
They are
عملکرد و یا
actually going to
برای
make of Alatra
چیزی را که
what they
امروزه
are planning to
زندگی ایمان
do.
در آن
And this
وابسته
is
است
absolutely
انجام
obvious from the
دهیم
very
و
fact of setting
حالا تو
such a
امروزه
precedent in
به
public
چشم
view
خیلی
is
ها
what they
مثل
can
این
learn to
شده
do to
است که
anyone else.
هیچ کس با آن
Exactly.
باور
That's basically how
ندارد. برعکس
totalitarianism begins
در
in reality. It all starts with taking one
فیلم
group of people,
تاثیرم اگر
banning it
شما
in one
ببینید
place, defaming it in another,
دقیقا
and then on this
چیز
basis,
را که من
legislation is
میگویم و
adjusted.
یا
When that is
چیز
done
را
in
که
one
شما امروزه میخواید در مورد آن صحبت کنید بسیار است و بسیار چیزی را که همه ما درباره آن میدانیم
Again, it's
و
important to understand
امروزه
what is the driving
همه
force.
آنها
It is the
برای
fear
ما
that
یک
is artificially
عمل
induced
زشتی
in
انجام
people.
میگویند انجام
Someone
دادیم
may say,
ولی این
well,
چیزهایی را
revolution
که
has
ما
written
میخواهیم
something,
برای
for example.
مردم برای
Why is
آنها
he supposed to
بدانند
be an
و
agent?
از این یک
However, the
درسی
world is
بگیرند
arranged a
تا
little differently. If
برای
somebody
چیزی را
gives
که ما
money
انجام میدهیم
and a person writes
اگر شما
something
یک
for that
آسیایی
money,
می
he
بودید
sort of
چی؟
signs a contract.
این رو
If that
بدانید
person
که
thinks that he's
زندگی
fine, that
همه
he only
من
wrote his opinion, but he
فقط
was way
زندگی
fine,
من و
then of
زندگی شما
course
نیست
there are
بلکه
documents
زندگی
regarding
همه
that.
من در این وابسته
But
است
then if, let's
اگر
say, God
انجام
forbid,
نشود
a discredited part of humanity, in this
و
case,
این نه
allows
تنها
it, gets
در این
liquidated,
حالت
the next step would be to maintain contact with those people who were involved and to force them to do what their
اینها
customer
را می
wants.
توانیم برای
Because you would
انجام
say,
زندگی و
look, I have
زمانهایی را
documents
که
here
می توانیم
indicating that
برای
you have
آن وقت
destroyed a
بگذاریم
peaceful
انجام
organization.
دهیم و اینها برای
If
همیشه
you
می
want, I will
تواند
forward them to
برای
law
ما
enforcement agencies and
زندگی
put them
و
to jail.
علاقمند
Or they would
هایی را که
create
ما
other ways
داریم
to press
انجام
those
شود
people. And those executors will do what they want in the grip of fear. Because this hydra
آیا اینها می تواند
is built first and
برای ما
foremost on
انجام
fear.
شود و یا برای تک تکی از ما
Now we're
مردم
talking about those
چیزهایی را که می
journalists
خواهیم
who
انجام
simply don't
شود
have moral values,
اینها
who
را
don't have
برای
any
همه ما باید
natural
بیشتر
human
بدانیم و
scruples.
اینها برای تک تک ما
But at the same time,
بسیار
there are
مهم
a
خواهد
huge
بود
number of journalists
اما
who
در این
simply
حالت
search for the
چیزهایی
truth
را که ما
and
می‌خواهیم
fight
در
for these
مورد آن
values
را
to be
صحبت کنیم
preserved in
و
our
در
society.
مورد آن ما
We're now
وقت
voicing all this
وقت خود را
information for them as well,
بگذرانیم این است
trying to
که
uncover these mechanisms
داشتن
together with them.
همچنین
So, I
هدف‌های
think we
مهم
can
در
now move on
زندگی
to
ما
how the
بسیار
Alatra
مهم
movement
خواهد
is
بود
actually being maligned. But before that, I would just like to take the liberty of reading here
اما
some of
قبل
the
از
comments
آن
from TikTok
باید بدانید
that
که
actually appeared under
کارهایی
this
را که ما
event,
امروز انجام می‌دهیم
Roundtable,
همه
which was
آنها
the
برای
discussion
ما
program that
یک
also
زندگی
responded
و
to Egon Choulakian's call.
انجام کارهایی
So,
را که
the
در
first comment,
می‌خواهیم انجام
false
دهیم
propaganda by the
ساده
US,
و به نظر
only
برسد
a
اما
pro-Western chump
اینها
can believe this.
می‌تواند برای
What about
ما
it? Do you want to
زندگیمان را
comment on
برای
that?
همیشه و برای
What's next?
I've
تک
got
تک
more to
از
go.
ماها یک
Okay. I don't
فرصت
understand
جدیدی
this
وارد
broadcast.
نماید و
Are you
اگر
defending
اینها می‌تواند
capitalism?
برای همه
That's
ما
what this
انجام
broadcast
دهد
sounds
و
like.
برای همه ما یک
We
ساختار
are
جدید
defending values that in
شبیه
democracy we
کارفرمایی و
defend that every
کارآموزی
person should be
برای
able to live in
مردممان که
accordance
بودند
with those
انجام
rights
شود.
that are not just on paper, but that are actually realized in our society.
Here is
I might add that sometimes when people actually ask me, because we're really so divided today, we can't really imagine how divided we are. People ask me, and you're pro American or you're pro Russian? And my answer is, I'm pro human. So they stay looking at me like, what is that?
Well, when you think about it, it's just the principle of division that we need the other person to tell us, you are so pro American, you are so pro Russian. So that in itself, that question sort of makes absolutely
خب
no
اینجا چیزی
sense
را
from a
می
human
توانید
perspective.
ببینید و
It's so
چیزهایی را که
simple.
من
Sit
میخوام
down,
برای
let's
شما
look at the
هم
planet
نشان
Earth
دهم
and
و
let's ask ourselves
اینها
if we
برای
are
تک
going
تک
to be
از ما
interested
مهم
in
خواهد
this.
بود.
that's right. And I just want to emphasize
این
that
درست
actually these
است. خب
comments that are under that
می
video and
توانیم
under Egon
برای همه
Choulakian's
انجام
video,
دهیم
they
و
show how
برای
divided we are.
هر آن کسی که میخواهد
How
در مورد
somebody
اینها
artificially divided
بیشتر
us and
بدانند
forced us,
معلومات
yes,
دهیم.
that's the right word, forced us to take somebody else's side. And who is going to
و
side with
این
the
چی
people?
معنی
Are we
دارد؟
openly interested in that?
Well, that's the ALLATRA International Public Movement.
That's
It
right.
has to be said that the ALLATRA International Public Movement has stood
این
from its very
میتواند
beginning until
برای
now and will always
هر یکی از
stand on the
ماها
side of the truth.
زندگی جدید
It's
را
important
بسازد
to
و
understand one
برای
more thing
همه
here.
ما یک هدف و
Actually, there are numerous rumors
مشق‌هایی را
that
که
are
می‌خواهیم
undoubtedly
انجام دهیم
unfounded.
بنویسیم و
Unfortunately,
آیا
we
اینها
see
میتواند
people who
بیشتر
have
از
chosen to
آن
disseminate
چیزی
this
را که
information as they
انجام
are
داده
doing.
ایم انجام دهد؟
Well, what can we
اینها
say when other
یک
people
زمانی
remain
بودند که
silent? That's a big
فرقه‌گرایان
problem for
ضد
all of us.
علیه
You
ما
see,
بودند و
the
هیچ چیزی
truth
را
itself,
برای
if it
ما
lacks support from
نمیگذاشتند
the
که انجام
people, doesn't
دهیم.
stand a chance. If people
اما
stay
اینها
silent, it will turn
نمیتوانستند
out the
برای
same way it
جلوی
did
ما آن
before
را
World
بگیرند
War
تا
II.
ما کار
Huge
را انجام
genocide,
ندهیم.
huge problem. And at this moment, it is important to realize that we
زندگی
have another enemy,
مشکلات
much,
بزرگش
much stronger. We are not enemies to each other.
که ما قبلا
There is
دیده ایم و
another enemy.
در مورد آنها
It's
هم
the planet
میدانیم که
Cerberus. Because these disasters, my friends,
چه کسانی این را
There
انجام
is
دادند.
absolutely no question that the increase in climate
اینجا
disasters
خب در
is
اینجا
exponential.
متاسفانه هیچ
This
سوال
means
باقی
that each
نمیماند.
and every one of us will
این
most likely
بدان معناست
experience a major climate disaster in the
که
next
شما
few
اینها
years.
را تجربه کرده اید
It's just the
و
way
همه
it is.
اینها را
It's
میدانید.
pure math. This is not some apocalyptic
اینها
stuff.
میتواند برای ما یک هدف
That's
و
one of the disinformation
مشتاقهای
plans
بسیار
that they try
قوی
to put on
باشد
us and on the work of the Allatra international public movement.
و
No, that is
آلترا
pure
اینها را
math.
میتواند
It's
که
pure
ببینید.
forecasting, pure statistics.
این برای همه شما پادکست
You know
خواهد
what
بود.
still amazes me is that I believe it's an undeniable fact that the climate is changing. Everybody should see that.
اینها
Those
میتواند
who just don't put blinders on
انجام
themselves.
کارهایی باشد که
I wonder why
هیچگاه
instead of
در آن
all of
ما
us
روبرو
coming
نشده
together,
ایم
sitting
و
down at the same
هیچگاه در
table and
مورد آن
discussing all these
صحبت
climate
نکرده
issues,
ایم.
we're still
اما
arguing,
اینها
pointing
میتواند
fingers,
برای ما یک
slandering, and so
عملکرد
on.
بسیار قوی باشد.
There's so much talk about the climate, that it's this factor, that it's that
در
factor,
اینجا
that it's a cycle, that it's not a cycle,
چیزهای
and so
زیادی را
on. Well,
میبینیم
when
و
And
someone
who denies the
معلوماتهای
solution?
yeah,
بسیار
sure. So let's all
زیادی را
sit
در
down at
اینجا
the same
شما
table
میبینید
together
که
and figure it out, right?
میتوانید
Let's
درباره
work on
آنها
finding a
صحبت
solution
نمایید.
together, and that way we can find a solution because it's very simple. Instead of all of this slanderous
آیا
talk,
اینها را
let's
میتوانید
sit down at the
انجام
table
دهید
like
کارهایی را
normal
که
adults and
میتواند
discuss
بر
it.
علیه همه
That's
ما
all we're
به
asking
سادگی
for.
نماید.
We're openly calling for the establishment of a unified scientific center. That sounds like a fantastic solution to me. Bringing all the scientists
اینها
together,
را
all the
باید
countries together,
هر یکی از
leaving
ما
egos
بدانیم
aside.
که
No
چی
country will be
چیزی در
above the
حال
other, but they'll all be on
کدام
the same
کشوری
page,
میتواند
working
برای
together to
ما
find a
این کار
solution.
را انجام
That's
دهد و
exactly
چی
what they show
کسانی
in all those
میتواند
American movies.
اینها
So
را
why can't it happen in real life if it
برای
can
ما
happen
انجام
there?
کارهایی باشد
well,
و
the
یا
problem is
برای
also
کسانی که
that we need
انجام
to start
میدهند.
engaging in critical thinking. We've stopped verifying
آیا اینها
information.
برای همه
We've
ما
been
یکسان
urging
خواهد
people
بود؟
for 10 years to
نخیر،
fact check
بلکه
information.
اینها
Why is
میتواند
that? Because it's
زندگی من
crucial
را
for our
از
survival.
این
Because
رو به
someone
آن
can
رو
come
نماید
along,
و
throw out some
زندگی همه
information,
من را
and I don't
برای
care.
همیشه
I'm either
نابود
going to
کنم.
accept the information or I'm not going to accept the information. Instead of checking it out.
شاید اینها نتوانند برای ما یک عملکرد قوی باشد یا هر آن چیزی را که میخواهیم داشته باشیم، ولی این را باید داشته باشیم که چی چیزهایی و چی کارهایی را برای همه ما انجام داده ایم. آیا اینها همهشان میتواند برای ما یک عملکرد قوی و یا دشواری باشد که ما درباره آنها معلومات داشته باشیم؟
That's a very important point of
البته
critical
چیزهایی را
thinking,
که
because
این
when
روزا
you
در
think
مورد
about it,
آنها
the
میخوام
very basic
صحبت
emotion
نمایم و
that's
یا
being
در
manipulated
مورد
in
چیزهایی
public
را که
space in the
شما
media
دیده اید
is fear.
آن را
That's
ساده
what you were
نگیرید،
talking
بلکه
about,
آنها
fear.
میتواند
When the
برای هر
information
یکی
comes
از ما
in, that's our
انجام
actual
کارهایی
reaction.
باشد
There is
که
psychological research
برای
in
تک
that.
تک از
So
مردم
if the
ضد
information comes by the
فرقه‌گرایان
means of
نابودیشان را
television,
اعلام
especially in
نمایند
visual form, and it is imbued with fear, then a person
و
accepts it
اینها
without any
برای
critical
هر یکی
analysis of
از
the
ما
fact that things
و این
could have
معنی
been
مدرسه
different.
نه فقط کنید. آیا اینها را میتوانید برای هر یکی از ماها انجام آنها را داشته باشد و این را شما باید بدانید که داشتن یک زندگی برای کودکانمان چقدر مهم خواهد بود و اگر ما برای آن کار انجام دهیم یعنی
Here's
ما
another very
هیچ
important
کاری
point
برای
to realize that we are
فرزندانمان
actually
و
shifting
برای
responsibility.
آینده
This is,
آنها
shall we
وقت
say,
نگذاشته ایم
the foundation of everything these subhumans have built their game on.
و اینها می تواند
Shifting
برای
responsibility.
ما یک دستور و
I
یا
didn't say anything.
عملکردهای
He said it.
بسیار مخفیانه
They did
باشد.
it.
They'll
They
decide.
caused it. They have decided. They are obliged to do
آنها
something about it
دیدند که
because there
آنها
were a lot
آنها
of
را
comments like that.
خواستند
What
که
can I do
انجام
about it?
دهند.
That's what scientists are for. And people don't even
نه
realize what a
چیزهایی را که
difficult
ما
situation
میتوانیم در
scientists are
مورد
in
آن
today.
If this
صحبت
person
نماییم.
would even ask him herself, how can I
اینها
help them to
میتواند
start
برای ما
solving this problem?
کارهایی را انجام
They
دهد
live on
که
this planet, but
هیچ
going
چیزی
back to
نمیتواند
actually the
برای ما
manipulation that's
آن را
going on
داشته
right now
باشد.
and our topic. So why is the KGB Hydra currently trying to eliminate the international activities of the ALLATRA International Public
اینها
Movement
آیا
the way
برای
it
تک
did
تک
in
از
Russia,
ماها یک
the way it did by
زندگی و یا
analogy
برای
in
ما
Ukraine,
انجام کارهایی را که میخواهیم
and as it
انجام
is
خواهد شد
already making efforts to do in the Czech Republic
و
and
اینها
Slovakia?
برای انجام
That is
مردم و
already in the
برای
democratic
زحمت
countries of
آنها
Europe.
انجام می شود و اینها
One
را
of the
می توانیم
negative
برای
words that
تک
is
تکی
being
از
spread
ما
in the
انجام شود.
disinformation campaign, the one charged with the emotion of fear. Which word is that?
آیا
When
اینها را
someone says
برای
the world
هر
called to you,
کسی
what's
که
your
در
reaction?
اینجا میخواستند کار را انجام دهند یا
I
هر
don't
آن
know how
کسی
a
که می
person
توانستند
would react.
اینها را انجام دهند انجام دهیم
Great, I'm
یا
with
در
you.
غیر
We'll
این
find out
و
more
می
about this.
توانستیم
I'll jump
کارهای را.
into it right away.
What
خب
is the
بیاییم در
natural
مورد
reaction of the
چیزهای
vast
صحبت
majority of
نماییم
people
که
when someone is
انجام
labeled
دهیم.
as cult? What is the natural reaction?
Well, they will immediately back off.
Just
They'll
distance.
get
این را می
scared.
توانید
Visualize images
انجام
of
داده
fighting,
شود.
Negative,
violence and stuff.
extremely
And the
negative.
person doesn't investigate the information further, just
اینها
doesn't go
را
any
برای
further.
هر
Exactly
آن
like on the
یکی
news,
از
the
ماها باید
information comes to you,
انجام شود و
fear, it's
همه
true.
ما
So
باید
in this case,
بدانیم.
absolutely the same analogy. I don't go further, I don't explore more because of this principle.
Or when some
آیا
good
اینها را می
movements
توانید
like the
برای
ALLATRA International
کارهایی را
Public
که
Movement, which is just
قبلا
as we
انجام
said, standing
داده
for
ایم یا
people and trying to
الان
solve the
میخوایم در
climate
مورد آنها
problem,
بحث
someone calls
نماییم
it a cult,
برای همیشه
then
ببندیم.
automatically in their mind the intentions can't be true because they're sectarians. For example, I've observed that kind of thing
این
in
چیزهایی
myself.
را که
When
ما
somebody tells me that
انجام
this
داده ایم
organization wants to do something good, but watch out, it's a cult. Well, if it's a
اینا
cult, I don't want to hear
همهشان
any more about
برای
it, do
ما
I?
انجام
I might
کارها
add
و
one more thing, as you were
چیزهایی را
saying
که
just now,
میخواستیم
how the
انجام
ban
شده
on
است
Russia and Ukraine came about. That this is absolutely
و
beautiful
این
proof
بود
of
در
how the
مورد
organization actually
کارهایی
works.
را که در
It's like transnational. It doesn't care what
اوکراین
relationship any countries or any states
آنقدر
make.
مغرور
It
باش که
just
همه ازت
works on its own
متنفر
way in
باشند
each
ولی
country
به
to
کسی
achieve the
اجازه نده که
objectives.
فکر کنه
That is,
گدایی
in
محبتش
Ukraine,
هستیم.
they label Allatra as
بفهمی که حتی نزدیکتر
pro-Russian,
به آدمهای
funded by
زندگی
Russian
داخل به
sources.
خودشان
And in
هستند
Russia, they label
و اینها
Allatra
را
as
باید
pro-Ukrainian,
تمام
funded by
ما
Ukrainian
یک
sources.
مثل
Well,
یک
someone
درس
asked, what
در
is your
فکرمان
reality?
باشد و در
Dr.
ذهنمان
Choulakian,
این
who
را
works for
داشته
US
باشیم که
intelligence, is going to
دکتر
speak
اگون
here. Isn't
چولاکیان
that strange and
میتواند
interesting?
این
And maybe
همه
even a little humorous for
کارها را
some who
برای
write those
ما انجام
comments. I think they
دهد
must have been
و
shocked when they watched
میتوانیم
the
برای
video.
این
I
کارها
would
وقت
just like to add
بیشتری
here to what you said,
بگذرانیم و
Veronica,
اینها را
that it really took
برای
me by the
ما
way when
یک
Egon Choulakian named
سازمان
specific
های
practices and manipulations that
زندگی که
appeared in the
میکنیم
media.
و
When,
برای
for
انجام
example,
این
it is known that
کارها
there were human
انجام
raids,
شود
searches, and so on in Ukraine. And there was a casual news report about the fact
و
that during
اینها
the
را
searches, they
اگر ما
confiscated a
انجام
pensioner's
بدهیم و برای
savings,
اینها
a
وقت
pensioner who actually supported the Allatra movement.
بگذاریم
And they
میتوانیم به
presented it in the
چیزهای
media that
بسیار
this was
بالایی دست
supposedly
یابیم.
Kremlin money that this pensioner had hidden in her home, and it was from the Kremlin. I thought to myself, that's impossible.
I think it
این
shows
را برای
beautifully the absolute
تک
cynicism
تک از
and
ماها
the
انجام خواهد
attitude
شد.
that is absolutely unrestrained. It's important to actually bring up another point here,
و به
which
نظر
is that
این کارها
we
را
are already
میتوانیم
talking about a concrete
برای
form
همیشه
of this
و
smear
برای
campaign.
متوقف کردن
But
اینها
this smear
انجام
campaign
دهیم.
was not launched directly by the KGB Hydra. It is using its
به نظر ما
tentacles,
که اینها
metaphorically
میتوانند
speaking, of course,
برای
from
هر یک
where
از
it
ما
operates.
یک
And
قدم
these are the
جدید و برای
so-called
هر یکی از
anti-cult
ماها
movements.
انجام شود.
Yeah, it actually works through what is called two-step camouflage.
و
It
این
finds an
برای ما
organization, a
میتواند
front
کار
organization
را
or a
و
dummy
یا
organization that
عملکردهایی
is at the
را
forefront so that
انجام
it is
دهد.
not visible itself. Just like the Hydra, it hides down and actually uses these anti-cult organizations to do just that. And it might be worth remembering something
این
about anti-cult
چه چیزی
organizations here,
میتواند
because when
برای
I
ما
first
انجام
saw
شود.
Dr. Choulakian's video, It was a
آیا می
pretty new
توانید در
term to
مورد
me, and I had to
اینها
do some
برای ما
research on my
معلومات
own.
دهید؟
I think it's true for all of us. We too were shocked at how much they actually got under our skin. The fact that they have
آیا
infiltrated
اینها را می
into the
توانیم باید
information
تک تک از
space, how
اینها
much we
انجام دهیم
ourselves are
یا
actually
برای
manipulated by the
کارهایی را
impact
که
they've
ما وقت
created
گذاشتن
in that
دهیم؟
public opinion.
And finally, how much it affects us in everyday life. I didn't realize that at all. For example, the first anti-cult movements actually started
آیا
in
اینها را می
America
توانیم
because in the 50s and
برای آنها
60s,
انجام
there
شود؟
was a big demand. People just needed something new. There were a huge number of new religious
آمدم با
movements, and in
آموزش
response
دیگه
to these newly emergent
پشتون
religious
باشم و این
movements, the
روش رو
so-called
پیدا کردم که الان
anti-cult
میخوام خرابش
organizations were
کنم و
created.
این
The first
چیزی که میخوام
organizations were
در
rather
موردش
local,
انجام
and
شود.
then they started to associate on a national level.
I might just make one more little
می شود
remark
برای
here. Actually,
ما
in
کار را
researching
انجام
that
دهد یا
information, so that
عملکرد را
it's
نشان
also
دهد که
understandable to the
می
viewer in
تواند
our area.
برای همه
When you
ما
say anti-cult
یکسان باشد
movement
و
for us,
همه اینها
for Americans,
برای
when
ما
you say
یک
cult, it doesn't
زندگی
have that
بسیار ساده ای را
negative
یا
connotation.
مهمی را
It's
برای
not
ما
filled with that fear
بسازند.
as it is here. Because they just perceive it as some Buddhist sects and so on. But for them, the word cult has the same meaning because they originated in
آیا
America.
اینها
Those
را می
anti-cult
توانید برای
movements, well, for
عملکرد
us,
یک
they are
کاری
actually
یا داشتن
anti-sectarian.
داشتن
Anti-sectarian
این همه
or
کارها را
movement for
داشته
the
باشد
study of
یا
cults or
خیر؟
new religions. It's such a nice democratic name they
آیا
gave it.
برای اینها می
Those
توانیم
first anti-cult
یک
movements
راه
actually
جدید
were.
بسازیم
What's interesting is that these
یا می
anti-cult
توانیم
movements operated in
برای
a
ما
very
یک
extremist way.
راه
Because
جدید و
behind that,
عملکرد
they were
جدید
afraid.
را
They considered
برای تک
people
تک
who were
از
joining
مردم
these
داشته
new religious
باشیم؟
movements to be psychologically manipulated, that they were some sort of weaker individuals who
این
were
چی به
just being
نظر شما می
influenced.
رسد؟
The
این چی
term
چیزی
brainwashing was not
هست که
coined at
امروز
that
ما
time.
نمیتوانیم در
It's called
مورد آنها بحث
brainwashing.
نماییم، ولی
They just
ضد
believed that
فرقه گرایان
these
در
people
مورد
were
هر
simply
آن چیزی که
inferior
میخوان انجام
individuals who
دهند
were
و کارهای
incapable of
غیر
making
عادلانه
independent
برای
choices, and
آنها
that they
انجام
were
دهند.
joining these new religious movements under the influence of some psychological manipulation.
این
And the first
چیزی است که
anti-cult
ما
movement, FRECO, it
امروز
started in America,
میتوانیم
was
در
founded by
مورد
Christian
آنها
fundamentalists at
A
Patrick.
یک
A
fundamentalist.
fundamentalist,
زندگی را
yes.
داشته
So
باشیم
Ted
و
Patrick, what's interesting about him is that he was the first
نه
one
این
who came up with
چیزی
the methodology
نیست
of
که همه
personality
ما بخوایم
profiling of
در
these
مورد
people. They
آنها
believed so much that
ساده
these
یا راحت از
individuals
آن
were like
بگذریم.
psychologically weak or manipulated or brainwashed, that they literally kidnapped these people from these
آن
sects, as they
نمیتواند
call it, and kept them
انجام
locked up in a
شود.
hotel for
خدای
weeks.
می‌سه.
They
کار
were
می‌دانم این
brainwashing
مسافر
them in
سخت
their
است،
own
اما تو
way,
باید
in basically
آرزوهای را
exactly the
دنبال
same
کنی که
way,
بتانی.
only with the opposite
آیا اینها
narrative.
می‌تواند
And mocking, for
برای
example,
ما
the leader of
انجام
the
کارهایی
movement,
باشد
keeping them
یا
there by force,
برای
and so on
به
and so
دست
forth. There
آوردن
was a huge
چیزی
debate of
را که امروزه
kidnappings,
در
and
مورد
Ted
آن
Patrick was behind them.
داشته‌ایم؟
And interestingly enough, later on in America, he just was sued many
یا خیر،
times.
یا این چیزهایی
Actually,
را
he
که ما
had to
امروزه
pay
در
back
مورد
some
آنها
money and
صحبت
so on,
می‌کنیم
and
یا
had to somehow
آنها
make
را می‌خوایم
amends to these
برای همیشه
families who
برای
actually suffered.
خودمان
And in
حفظ نماییم،
fact, what's
مثل
interesting is
زندگی را
that
که
these anti-cult
همیشه
movements for
برای
me
آن
are actually
کوشش و
kind of
تلاش
like a
نموده
modern
هستیم.
day Inquisition. Don't you find it a bit similar?
Well, you actually said that the founder was a Christian
آیا
fundamentalist.
همه
Yes.
این
And what's even
میتواند
more
برای ما یک
interesting is that actually in
رویداد جدید
America,
یا
there were
برای عملکرد
organizations that
کارهایی را
started to
که
take
انجام
sides
داده ایم
to actually
انجام
advocate
شود؟
for these cults. There was an organization there called ASR,
نه خیر، فکر
and that's actually an
به نظر می رسد
organization that
که
fights
این
for
کارها
religious
را که ما
freedom.
میخواهیم برای
And they've
شما
managed to
نشان
sort
دهیم
of
و
pacify these
عملکردهایی را که ما
anti-cult movements
میتوانیم
a little
برای
bit. But
همه
they
شما
haven't quite managed to
به
do that
طور
in Europe and in
جذاب و
Russia.
یا
And what's
عادلانه
actually
ای که میتوانیم
interesting,
در
the
مورد
anti-cult
آنها صحبت
movements then
نماییم،
started to
از
emerge in
ما
parallel
اجازه
all over
داده
the
نمی
world.
برای
I
ما
think it
که
was in
اینها
1993
کارها را
when the
انجام دهیم.
anti-cult movement emerged in Russia, and it was founded by
و
Alexander
این
Dworkin.
چیزی
And
نیست که
then in
امروزه فقط من در
1994, the
مورد اینها
European
صحبت میکنم،
Association,
بلکه
or as they
در
call it,
مورد
umbrella
این همه
organization
مردم
first,
میدانند و
i.e.
همه
Bucharest
در
cover
مورد اینها با
organization, in
خبر
which he
هستند که
later
چگونه
became the vice
میتوانیم
president. And for a long
این
time,
کارها
from
را به
2009 to
حد
2021, it was
ساده نماییم و
Alexander
به حد
Dworkin who was its
اینها را انجام
president.
دهیم
And we'll
که
come back to him
ساده
because
و
this
به
is a very
روش
interesting
دیگری را
figure.
که
That's
ما گفته
Mr.
ایم
He was
انجام
mentioned by
دهیم.
our friends in the round table as a controversial, absolutely controversial person who actually imposed the whole view of new
این را
religious
میتوانید
movements
برایم یک
spiritual movements,
دستورالعملی
the
یا
practice
برای
of
ما
yoga and
کاری
so
را
on,
بگویید
and
که
painted
برای
them
همیشه
literally
در
black and
مورد
white
آنها ما
colors.
صحبت کرده
What is
ایم و
right? What is
می
wrong?
توانیم آن
What
را
actually
به
happens to a
سادگی
person when they
بگذرانیم.
become a participant in such a movement? And it was this person who
این
actually
را می
created such an
توانیم
image.
برای
In other
هر
words,
یکی
we can
از
trace
کسانی
it
که
as much
می
as
خوانند در
possible
مورد
to the
اینها
creation of an image
انجام
of
دهند یا
how we
صحبت
understand the
نمایند.
term sect today.
آیا
And not
همه
just
اینها
sect.
را
He was the
شما
first
هم
who
می
created
دانید
the term
که چگونه
totalitarian
انجام می
sect in
شود
1993. And what's
یا فقط
interesting, he
کارهایی
also,
را
like
که
Ted Patrick, for example, was a Christian
می شود در
fundamentalist,
مورد
and
آنها
Alexander
صحبت کرد
Dworkin is an
در
adherent
مورد
or a member of the Russian
انجام
Orthodox
کاری
Church. And
یا
basically, for
برای
him, anything that is not the Russian
متخصص
Orthodox Church is a
داشتن در کارهایی
totalitarian
را که
sect.
ما می
He has
خواهیم
gone
انجام
so far, of
دهیم.
course, that he attacks other religious movements,
نخیر
such as
شاید
the
این
Jehovah's
چیزی باشد
Witnesses.
که ما
They
در مورد
actually, because of
آنها
his very strong
انجام می دهیم
persecution
یا
and pressure,
در
have been
مورد
banned in
چیزی که
Russia. I think in
صحبت می کنیم
2017 it was
انجام شود.
countrywide. I
ولی
think their
و
headquarters in
چیزی
Moscow
را
was
که واقعا
banned.
می
He
توانیم
also was
آن را
critical of
داشته باشیم و یا
Scientologists.
آن را
Then
در
he had a very
دستمان بگیریم
As for
این
Scientologists,
است
for
که
example, they
همه
have
ما
a
باید
very negative
درک
reputation all over the world.
Well,
همگی
he's done a
ما
lot of work in
همپذیری
this
داشته
regard
باشیم
because
و
he's
همه
literally
ما
like
باید
persecuting
بدانیم
these other
که
religious movements like
این
Falun
چیزها
Gong, for
نمیتواند
example.
برای
Anything
جلوی
that is not the
رفتنمان را
Russian
یا
Orthodox
جلوی
Church goes
گرفتن
against them.
کار را که
He's
میخوایم
very
انجام دهیم
extremely negative
بگیرد.
about all Eastern religious movements,
Wait, you
actually.
said Falun Gong.
Falun Gong, yes.
I think this
و
movement is
اینها
very
را
well known in our
برای
country, and it is a
چیزهایی
movement
میگویم و
that is
برای
facing
کسانی
genocide
می
in its
نویسم
homeland.
که
In China.
That's right, genocide,
در
literally.
چین
And this is a guy who actually supports
نسل
fighting
کشی
those movements. Well, just so
انجام
we
می
know who
شود.
we're dealing with.
Basically, we can say that this person is convinced that the only
ما
correct faith
این را
is
می
his
توانیم
worldview,
بگوییم
meaning the Orthodox
که
Church.
چی
And
چیزی
he's trying to
امروزه از
somehow
زندگی همه
denigrate
من را
anything that is different
برداشتن
from it.
و خراب کردن
Well,
اینها کرده
actually, he
است.
does it in such a way that in regard to those cults,
این در
totalitarian
راهی در
sects
حالی
in
است که
general,
همه ما این را بیشتر
and
از
all
همه
the
می توانیم
teachings
درک
different
نماییم
from the
که
only correct one.
مردم و
He
داشتن
attributes to them various features that
کسانی
should be typical
که
only for
امروزه
them.
در مورد
That is
آنها
a
صحبت می
strong
شود
charismatic
و
leader and absolute submission to his opinion.
فقط برای
Not
آنها
only
نیست که ما
that,
امروزه
if you look at his statements on the internet, he
شانس
goes to the very
آنها را بیشتر
extremes.
و
He characterizes
بهتر
leaders or entire
بشناسند.
organizations
بلکه
extremely
امروزه
negatively. He tells that
همه
they sell
ما
drugs,
این را
that there is a
باید درک
sexual
نماییم و بدانیم چه
abuse there, and so on.
کسانی
For
می
example, I
توانند
watched a
برای
video
ما
where he spoke on
انجام
television,
چنین کارهایی را
as I
برای مردم
remember, on
اجازه
Moscow
دهند.
TV about Krishna
این
worshippers.
فقط
And
برای
interestingly, I
استفاده
found
از
a
مردم
huge
نیست،
amount
این
of
برای
evidence on the
همه کسانی
internet
است که
what other
میخواهند
experts from
زندگیشان
other
را
countries,
بهتر
professors of
نمایند
religious studies, philosophy, and so on, say about him.
Real
یا
experts.
Real experts, unbiased experts who had a chance of meeting him, and almost all of them use the
آنها
word
را
crazy to describe
به
him, that
طور
he is insane. We can even
ساده
find
یا
evidence
عادی
in the web space
میتوانند
that this man, who is the leader of the
بشنوند.
Russian anti-cult movement, suffers from mental disorders, and not just one of them.
It is also important to note that regarding his psychiatric diagnosis, experts have actually assessed his personality type as totally unsuitable to hold such an important position.
یا
Exactly.
شاید
Make
هم
decisions about what happens in society, about
اینها
important things in
Mhm.
society.
And just to show the absolute absurdity of this man's behavior, he is not only going against classical new religious movements like the Jehovah's Witnesses or Scientologists and against Krishna worshippers, he is even critical of yoga, which is just absolutely absurd because nowadays every third woman on earth practices yoga. In his opinion, all women who practice yoga are sectarians just because they practice yoga. That's what he says.
I would now remind our viewers that this is such a tricky point. A person tends to think, this doesn't really concern me. But then such things manifest themselves in everyday life. They become quite visible. Actually, it can very quickly come to the point when it will concern absolutely every one of us.
I just wanted to add an interesting piece of information that such a person isn't really supposed to be in the leadership of such an important anti-cult organization. And not only in Russia, but he has been at the head of FACRIS for quite a long time, and he is to this day.
Perhaps we should explain once again what FACRIS actually is.
I already mentioned that it's
بود
an
که
umbrella
چگونه
organization of
آنها
anti-cult
میتوانند
movements in Europe.
از
It operates in
زندگیشان
40 countries,
بیشتر
5
و
of which are
بیشتر لذت
non-European.
داشته باشند و
While
به
this man was
پیشرفتشان
actually at
بیشتر
FAT for a
و
long
عمیق‌تر
time, and
اضافه
since
گردند.
2021 he has remained a permanent member of FACRIS,
و
although
از
FACRIS
سال
indicates on their website that
2021
he's no longer
بدین
connected
سو
with
ما
them, but the
ما
Russian anti-cult
توانستیم که
organization indicates
کارهایی
that
را
it is
انجام
still
دهیم.
associated with FACRIS. These are other interesting
و
manipulations
این
that
نه
can be
تنها
traced in the
برای
internet space.
عملکرد
These men
کارهایی
had an
را که ما
opportunity to
میخواهیم بگوییم،
directly influence
بلکه
the
برای
European
عملکرد
environment and thinking.
He
چیزهایی را
did
من میخواهم
influence.
در
These
مورد
very
آن
men
بگویم
Yes, this
که
man
همه
with
ما
very severe,
باید بیشتر و بیشتر
pluriprovable
بدانیم
psychiatric
و
diagnoses,
بیشترین
of
رای را
which a
در
great
مورد
number of
چیزهایی
experts
را که
around
ما
the world
جذب
have
کرده ایم یا
commented.
A
در
socially
مورد
dangerous
کسانی که
person.
میخواهیم
He's a
معلومات
socially
داشته
dangerous
باشیم
person.
باید
This
انجام
is
شود،
also
یا
proven by the
چیزی را که
fact that he was even
شاید چیزی
seriously
که
charged, in
ما
particular by
میخواهیم
Krishna
یا کار
worshippers,
را که ما
when he
میخواهیم
tried to
انجام
accuse
دهیم.
them, but the court dismissed the charge. A professor from Canada participated in the trial and said
شاید
that the whole trial
اینها
was
بتوانند
falsified.
برای ما
You can find
یک
this video on the
عملکرد
internet. It was all recorded, and Mr. Dworkin physically attacked a
شما می توانید
representative of
این
Hare
را
Krishna
در
there.
هر جایی که
The
میخواهید
police
ببینید
had to
و
intervene, and
چیزی
despite this
چی می تواند
incident, the
برای ما
court
یک کاری
dismissed
را انجام
charges
دهد
against
یا
him.
Well, if we listen to all of
برعکس
this, then
این
the
چیزی را که
question
ما
naturally
امروزه
arises:
میخواهیم در
how can this
مورد آن
factories, which
بگوییم
you've mentioned, be funded by the
یا
French
در مورد
government?
چیزهایی را که
Yes, it's partially
میخواهیم
funded by the French government.
آن را
That's
بیشتر
right.
That
داشته
means a huge
باشیم
additional
باید
reach
بدانیم.
and additional influence.
I also wanted to mention a religious movement in Russia, which was called the
من
Church of the Last
این را هم
Testament,
میخوام
or
اضافه
was also
کنم
known as the
که
Vissarion
چیزی
movement.
را که ما
Why do I
امروزه
mention it?
میخواهیم
Because this
آن را
movement
داشته
actually
باشیم
lives
و در
peacefully.
مورد
They
آنها
just bought a
بیشتر
piece of land
صحبت
somewhere in Siberian
شود.
taiga.
بهتر از
There
این
was a
را
whole
من
community
بگویم
of
که
people living there,
چیزی
and they lived
میتواند
peacefully
در
like that for
مورد
30
زندگی
years.
ما و
And
در
then what
مورد
happened?
زندگی
They started
کسانی را که
having
ما
a certain
امروزه در
political
مورد آنها
influence, and
میدانیم
recently, also on the basis of such
و در
lobbying work by
اواخر
Mr. Dworkin, this movement was
اینها
actually
ما
disbanded by
چیزی
the
را
Russian
یافته ایم که
authorities. Now hold on when you hear this. People who peacefully lived in that community were attacked by
منتظر این
50
باشید که
armed
شما هم
vehicles,
باید این
10
را
military
بدانید.
buses, and
بدانید
several
که
helicopters. In
آیا
my
شما هم
opinion,
می
it's
توانید
just
آنها را
insane
داشته
to
باشید؟
wage this kind of attack on ordinary civilians, on peaceful families who respected the law and simply lived their own life and had their own beliefs. For me, this is simply
It was actually
این
quite
ساده به
surprising
نظر
for
می
the
رسد.
intervening party that no one resisted them.
yes, no one resisted them.
They just came there fully armed.
درست است. این را من
Against
می گویم
ordinary
که این
people.
کارها را
This
می
is an
توانید
essential
برای
example for
عمل
us. We can really
آنها
say fully
انجام
armed.
شود.
You've put it just right.
ولی این
Listening to
چیزی را
this,
که
I
من
can't get
امروزه
my
می خوام در
mind
مورد
that these
اینها
anti-cult
بگویم، در
organizations
مورد این هم
resemble
گوش
modern-day
دهید که
inquisitions.
چیزی را که شما می خواهید در
They
مورد
have the
اینها
power to
انجام
themselves to
دهید
tell people where to go and not to go. This is actually terrorism.
Yes, you can go this way
کجا
and you can't go
بروند
that
و
way.
کجا می توانند بروند.
All this is what extremism
درست
and
است.
terrorism is. This is actually the worst
دقیقاً.
thing imaginable in a free society.
That's why the first
آیا
anti-cult
اینها
movements in
را
America were condemned as
دوباره
extremist,
ما
right?
باید بگوییم
And
چیزی
they were
را
banned there.
یا چیزی را که ما
Well, they
میخواهیم
weren't
در مورد
completely
این صحبت
banned.
شود
They had
این نیست
extreme
که
ways
ما
of depriving
نتوانیم این را
people,
داشته
and
باشیم.
yes, many of them were brought to justice. They had to answer for their actions, but they were not completely banned.
درست است. زندگی همه
And
مردم
here's another interesting
برباد
point.
خواهد
The
شد و
concept of
زندگی
brainwashing
هر
is
آن کسی که
mentioned
در اینجا زنده
just at the
هستند
time when
برباد خواهد شد.
anti-cult movements arose in America.
ولی
They completely
اگر
debunked this concept as pseudoscientific, as something that does not
و این
actually
می
exist.
تواند
And what
برای
the
ما یک
anti-cult
کاری را
movement
انجام دهد
is
یا
in the form they
برای ما
describe is something that lacks
انجام
scientific
چیزی
evidence.
باشد که برای هر یکی
So in
از
essence,
ما
anti-cult movements de
انجام
facto
برای داشتن
usually bring the
زندگی
presence
آرام
of
و
representatives of
راحتی خواهد
traditional
باشد.
churches there, especially the Roman Catholic or Russian Orthodox Church, and so
این
on.
می تواند برای ما راه
In a
حل‌هایی
way,
را نشان
protect these
دهد و
mainstream
کاری را بگوید
traditional
که
religions.
همیشه
But
در مورد
essentially,
آنها
they
ما
attack new
راه
religions.
اندازی و
They criticize
کوشش
what is
نهایی
actually
خود را کرده
inherent in
ایم
these
و
traditional
این می
churches.
تواند برای
I can only
کسانی
speak for
باشد
myself because I
تهدیدی
come
که
from a Christian
هیچ
tradition.
کسی در مورد
And from
آنها
childhood,
نمی‌دانند و
felt
هیچ
the
کسی
clergy on the
نمی‌خواهند در
altar.
مورد آنها
And now,
صحبت شود
yes,
و اگر
anti-cult movements condemn new religious
می
movements
توانیم
for
این
having
را برای ما انجام
an
شود یا
authoritative leader.
برای
But for me,
هر
as an
یک از
8-year-old
ما
child, when I helped in the altar,
داشتن چنین وظایف
our priest
حتمی
was a
یا
huge authority. So in a
برای
sense,
ما باید این را داشته باشیم،
anti-cultists should
باید
primarily
بدانیم
oppose the
که
largest
این را
traditional churches,
برای
not
پاکستان
the smaller ones.
این
I'll
را
just tell
داریم
you one
و
more thing.
فرصت
This
برای
information
این
that
چیزی
you are
را که ما
saying,
امروز
after all,
میگوییم
one may
خواهیم داشت
trace
و
a double
برای
standard
ما
here, that
چیزی
in one case
کوتاه‌تری و
it's
یا
absolutely something
داشتن
normal,
زندگی
ordinary, that a normal
نامرتب یا
person doesn't think
نامرئی
about.
نخواهد
Yes,
بود،
that's how it
که
works. But
اینها
in the other case, in the
میتواند
case
برای
of
ما
so-called new religious movements, sects, cults, the same thing is interpreted as something extremely
و
negative, as
اینها نه
something
تنها
to
برای ما
beware of,
میتواند
where
زندگی
we have
را
to watch out for
داشته
that because
باشد.
it's already manipulation and it's something
شاید اینها را
potentially
شما
extremely
ببینید و
dangerous for you. So
بگویید
it's
که
actually like the principle of manipulation that is used in
انجام داده
public
شوند
opinion, that we
یا
think of one
برای
thing as
ما
normal even though it's
داشتن
the same thing.
چنین
We don't think
زندگی
it's a bad
خواهد
thing at
بود.
all, and we think of the other one exactly the opposite.
Or in this way, the anti-cult movements actually label the new religious movements as millennialists. Sort of, they're expecting the end of the world and so on. But as for me, as a Christian, when we went to church, I mean, we normally
انجام
read
کاری
Revelation
باشد
of John and stuff.
Another example, yes.
We had a meeting every Thursday for us
شاید
altar boys, and
با
I remember
نظر
as a
ما
kid one moment
اینها
that I
ساده
just
باشد
once
یا
accepted the idea
برای
that
ما
if I really don't go
مشکل
to church every Sunday,
مهمی
when the
باشد،
final
ولی
judgment comes,
از یک
I
نظری
would
که ما
just get
امروز در
burned.
مورد آن
That the angels would
بحث
judge me
میکنیم
precisely as
این است
described in the
که
Revelation of John. So in the
شما
same
می
way,
توانید
they're
این را داشته
criticizing the new
باشید
religious
و
movements.
این را برای
Well, but
هر
David,
کسی
that
که می
means that
توانید
you were
انجام
part of a
دهید.
sect
شاید
because the
ساده
way you
باشد،
talk
نه
sounds
خیر.
like you were part of some sect.
این
Well,
نمی تواند
I
به این
attended
سادگی
the Roman
حمل
Catholic
شود یا
Church.
Well, I just wanted to add that what we've been
اینها
describing
می
is happening
توانند
in America and in Russia. We in the Czech Republic are no exception to that either. We could actually take a good look at how it works in our country as well.
Yes, because when you say the word sect, I think we all understand what a negative connotation it
بله
evokes in us. And what caught my attention was that part
این
of the
می
video of
تواند
Egon
انجام
Choulokian,
شود.
where he unveils the whole octopus, all the tentacles of Hydra, all
شاید
the heads of Hydra, where
اینها
it directs them
بتوانند
and
برای
for
ما
what
یک
they operate. So I was just
زندگی
interested in this notion
بسیار
of the anti-cult
دشوار
movement,
بسازند.
and I was searching what I
ولی
know about them
اگر
in
ما
general.
برای
Well, I knew
هیچ
practically
کسی
nothing before I
نگوییم
started
و
researching this
هیچ کسی
information,
نداند،
and I was
این
completely
یعنی که
unaware of
ما باید
one important
همه
fact,
جل
that
پستکمان را
being
جمع کرده و
indoctrinated from
این
our
پروژه را
school
همینجا
years
باید
with a negative
تمام
opinion
نماییم.
towards a sect. Attention, that a sect means manipulation, threat to life, threat to liberty, etc. The
شاید
anti-cult
ترس
movements,
اینها
the
باشد.
anti-sect movements are actually responsible for far more lives ruined and far more victims than all the sects
شاید
and
اینها
religious movements,
بتوانند
all these movements that the anti-cult movement is railing against. This was an absolutely shocking fact to me.
این مشکل است و
But to
این
put it
برای
simply,
ما میتواند انجام کارهایی باشد که
Huh.
because this is so, and we mentioned Falun Gong,
آیا
and we
ما
can go
میتوانیم
on.
اینها
We
را انجام
could go
دهیم؟
on and on, but right now we are going to focus on how it works here in the
ما
Czech
می توانیم
Republic,
آن را
because
انجام
one can
دهیم و
ask about
می
whether
توانیم کاری را
anti-cult
برای
movement
همیشه
works in our
که می
country,
خواهیم آن را
whether we
داشته
can
باشیم.
trace the influence of Mr. Dworkin and who Mr. Dworkin is.
شاید
I think it has
این
been
کارها به
explained
نظر
here. We
دشوار
understood. The
برسد
explanation has been quite clear and straightforward. So let's look at the parallels.
اگر
Thackeray's was
همه
founded
ما
in
این را داشته
our
باشیم که
country in
همه هم بتوانند
1993.
در مورد آن
1994.
صحبت
A
نمایند
society for
یا
the study of
بتوانند
sects
آن
and
را
new
درک
religious
نمایند
movements was
آنها
founded.
می
Parallel to
توانند
that,
انجام
the
دهند.
spokesperson for this Czech variant of the anti-cult movement is a religious
شاید
scholar who to
اینها
this day has been
انجام
denounced
کارهایی
for his
باشد یا
so-called
برای
censorship
داشتن
on new
زندگی
religious movements,
سریع یا
trends, and
مختصر که
particularly
همه ما در
sects.
مورد
And
آنها
he's also
میدانیم
the
و
editor-in-chief
معلومات
of
هم
an
خواهیم
online
داشت. این
media
را می
religious
توانیم داشته
info-service.
باشیم
His
و
name is
اینها را
Wojciech.
باید هر یکی
Right,
از
and
ما
you've mentioned
و
new religious movements and at the same time
کسانی که
sects,
این را
so maybe it would
میدانند
be good to
باید
explain
معلومات
to the
داشته
audience
باشند
how
تا
they are
هیچ
related
چیزی از
or
دستمان
what
دریغ
this is.
نخواهد شود
Basically,
و
nowadays, when we
اینها
hear
را
some speaker,
باید ما
like this
بدانیم
person
که
I mentioned earlier, it is often said
چی
that
چیزی
the
را
term
امروز
sect is no
میتوانیم
longer
داشته
useful
باشیم و
because
چی
it has
چیزی
some
برای ما
pejorative
انجام
flavor and
وظایف خواهد
everyone
بود.
already imagines a negative association with it. So
و این
nowadays we
را
actually use
شما
such terms
بیشتر
as
از
new
همه
religious
میدانید
movements,
که
but basically
چی
this is
کسی
the same
برای
as the
انجام
term
این
sect.
کارها
We
وقت
should
خود
just
را میگذارند.
emphasize that the pejorative undertone of the word sect was created by those fellows themselves, by active participants of the anti-cult movement.
Wait, just so I understand this correctly, this religionist, Wojciech himself, claims that he doesn't actually use the term sect, am I right? That he avoids the term sect when referring to new religious movements. And do they have, like, a website?
Well, David, if you Google Zdenek Wojtyszek, religionist, one of the first links is to his website. When you open his site, just on the homepage, you have a link that takes you
من وقت از
directly to the
فیسبوک ات چک
anti-cult
فیسبوک
movement,
ات را
and the
چک
site
کن
is
تو را
called
باعث ادمین در
secti.cz.
فیسبوک دیگر
Okay, so he's avoiding the term
تغییر
sect, but his domain is
گذاشتم گذاشتم
www.secti.cz, right?
Yeah.
Wonderful, perfect. And wait,
فردا
Mr. Zdenek Wojciech,
توانی
this is the same Mr.
از
Zdenek Wojciech
پیج
who is also the
فیسبوک
preacher of the
از
Church of the
پیج
Brethren, right? Just to
فیسبوک
be clear.
Right, yes,
مولد
we'll definitely come back to
یعنی
that because it's one of the next parallels
این
that we
را
can find between
می
our
توانیم
anti-cult
برای ما
movement and
یک
others that we've
زندگی
already
ساده
talked
باشد
about.
و
Wait, and this
همه ما
anti-cult movement,
برای این
I was just
کارها
searching for it. It's
انجام
called the
شود.
Society for the Study of Sects and New Religious Movements. And the chairman of this anti-cult
این را
movement
می
is a Roman
توانید
Catholic priest, right?
انجام دهید
I'm just
یا
trying to understand whether it's the same organization.
برای ما
I think
انجام
all the
شود یا
members, these
فقط
people, all
می
belong
توانیم
to the
برای
Christian
اینها انجام
church.
دهیم.
It just happens to be so.
It's so typical of
این
the
می تواند
anti-cult
برای ما
movement
زندگی
because
را
these,
برای
how shall I
همیشه و
put it,
برای
Founders,
هر یکی از ما
founders
انجام
or
شود.
actually members, they at the same time belong to the traditional church.
Because how can, in simple common sense terms, how can a representative of a religious movement independently evaluate other religious movements if he himself is convinced of the only correct faith? I mean, it's either the faith of the Roman Catholic Church or the faith of the Church of the Brethren. Whatever, right? So basically, it just doesn't make sense.
ایمان را
Study it and
بیشتر
have
و
no conflict of interest.
Right.
راحتر
that's
داشته
right,
باشد
because this is precisely the
انجام
point at
دهیم.
which we need to engage critical thinking. You have
این
traditional
درست است.
churches and the
خب
so-called new
می
religious
توانیم
movements
برای همه ایمان یک
and the
تغییر
expression
الحاق نماییم.
studying in quotes. But in fact, the suppression of new religious movements, which is carried out by people who support, who
خب
consider
اینها
themselves
را
part of
نمیتوان
these
برای
traditional
هر
churches,
یک
then
از
a
شماها توضیح
non-thinking
داد
person,
و
a
یا
healthy
هر
thinking
یک از
person
شما
should
برای
ask,
شما
is there not
انجام
a
شود.
conflict of interest here?
I'll also add to that because right after watching Egon Choulokian's video, I also searched for anti-cult. I was looking for what we can find, and I was shocked at how much experts, the unbiased scientific community, warn and caution about the influence of anti-cult movements. And since
و
we're
اینها
talking
در حال
about this
اتفاق
now, I'd
افتادن
like to
برای
say that this is
چیزی خواهد
one of
بود
the
و
specific
برای
points
عمل کردن
that they
آنها.
put a lot of emphasis on. That, in fact, there is this clash of interests there.
If we return to the concept of a new religious movement and the concept of
و
a sect,
این را
these religious
عملکرد
scholars
قوی را
say
خواهد
Buddhists
داد،
actually
بلکه برای
representatives of the
چیزی که
anti-cult
همه
movement
مردم
in
در
our
مورد
Czech
آن
Republic
بحث
do
میکنند
not
و
use
میخواهند
this
آن
term
را انجام
themselves.
دهند.
But indirectly, through the media, they say that it is the same thing. We will come to this later, but what do I want to say? That
و این را در
precisely on
مدیا
this
هم
internet
میدانند
resource,
که
which is
چه
run by
کسی
the
این کارها را
above-mentioned
انجام داده
religious
است و چه
scholars
کسی
and
از اینها
devotees,
سود میبرند.
we can see what a stunning campaign is conducted against the Allatra International Public Movement. Against this movement, I mean,
آیا اینها
there are
در
more
مورد
than
همهشان
25
ما
slanderous
میگوییم که
articles
اینها
about this
همهشان در
movement
مورد
on this
آلاترا
religious
هست،
infoservice.
ولی چیزی را که همه
And
باید
the
بدانند،
maximum merits in creation of these articles belong to two
همه باید
authors.
بدانند که این چیزها در حال
Two
اتفاق
religious
افتادن و
scholars.
در حال اجرا کردن کارهای خواهد بود که
Plenty of
انجام
articles.
آنها
Plenty of
هیچ
them.
تأثیری یا
Quite right.
هیچ
But it must be
یکی
said
از
that
این
we are
زندگی
talking
را
about
نخواهد
Mr.
تغییر
Ludwig
داد.
and his student. And to make it clear, the student himself, Mr. Ludwig,
و برای
who is also often quoted by
انجام
the
این
media,
کارها و داشتن
unfortunately,
این
his thesis, although
راهکارهایی
he
که
quotes
انجام می
other
شود
religious scholars,
دیده باید شود و
he
برایمان
eventually comes to the
انجام شود.
conclusion that
نه خیر،
it is
این نه
enough
تنها
for
برای
him
شما
if
می
he
شود
proceeds
بلکه
from the
این برای
theoretical concept
همه‌تان
of his
انجام
teacher,
خواهد بود
Zdeněk
شود.
Vojtěšek. That is, we have exactly the
اینها می
same
تواند
similar base of
برای ما
opinions
انجام
here.
کارهایی باشد
And if we summarize what lies at the heart of this idea, these thoughts,
این را می توانید
he
برای
himself
ما
emphasizes
انجام
in this
دهید یا
thesis.
برای
To
ما
summarize it
چشمهایی
simply,
را که
new religious
انجام می
movements
شود
are
انجام
conflictual.
دهیم.
Conflictual. It's a very brief summary that
آیا
actually speaks
برای
volumes.
هر
I would
یک از
perhaps
ماها
follow up on
انجام
that
دادن
right away,
چنین
as I
کارهایی را
mentioned,
که
those experts
می‌خواهیم انجام
would
شود
actually
یا
cautiously comment on
اینها را می
anti-cult
توانیم
movements. So we
انجام
can
شویم.
cite Mr. Luzhny's religious studies as an example. He is an unbiased religious scholar and he writes
آیا
about the
این
fact
را می
that the
توانید
anti-cult movement
شما
I will
درخواست
quote now
نمایند یا برای
touts with
شما
bias and
بگویند که
agitation about
داشتن
processes
چنین
that are described neutrally in the literature. It talks
چنین
of these
کارهایی را که ما
processes only in
انجام
the
می دهیم
context of
انجام شود.
tragic excesses. Thus, generalization results in describing ordinary processes as highly dangerous and exceptional phenomena. This is just to draw a parallel to what conflict means in the understanding of the anti-cult
I have a
movement.
و
question.
اینها
Why the
را
media
همه‌تان
don't use,
من
for
یک سوال
example,
دارم.
Mr. Luzhny, a religious scholar who
شما
really
همان
That's
چیز
a
را
good
در اینجا
question.
This is a
نباید
very good question because
زیر
we have
نظر و
experience
یا
as far
برای
as the
تحقیق
Allatra
برای آنها
International
داشته
Public Movement
باشیم،
is concerned. In one
چون
article, in a
اینها
slanderous
همه‌شان در
article with a
زندگی
purpose to
روزمره ما
defame, they also
تاثیر
appealed to
بسیار
Mr.
زیادی
Luzhny.
می‌گذارد.
But as he answered that the Allatra International Public Movement is not a sect, it cannot be called a
این
sect. This
چیزی را
movement
نشان
cannot be
می‌دهد
called a
و
sect. The
کاری
editor
را
didn't
برای
consult
ما
him afterwards.
So
انجام
can we
می‌دهد
sum it
که
up by
ما
saying that
باید
Mr. Luzhny
اینها
is not
را بیشتر
controversial
از
enough for
همه
our media?
باید بدانیم
Rather too
و
scientific, I would say.
Too
بیشتر از
scientific.
همه
Unlike
باید
Mr. Vojticek, who does
اینها
engage
را
in
در
independent
یک
scholarly religious studies.
So,
موضوع
if I have
دیگر
listened
که
to you
می‌خواهیم در
attentively, it is
مورد
clear to
آنها
me
بحث
now
نماییم باید
the new religious movement is equated with a sect.
این
Well, in its essence, yes,
این
because
برای
although the religious
هر یکی از
scholars
ما
led by
مهم
Mr.
خواهد بود
Wojciech
و هر یک از
avoid
ما
this
باید
term in every possible way, as for other articles in the media, as I said,
و اینها
journalists
را
have nothing
می توانید
against this term.
انجام دهید.
That is, they refer to those initial slanderous articles by Mr.
شاید
Wojciech
بعضی
and his
چیزها
disciple
و
Ludwig,
بعضی از کارهایی
while
را که
they
ما
themselves do not
امروزه
study a
می‌خواهیم
new religious
آن را
movement
مورد
at
بحث
all,
قرار
saying
دهیم
simply a
سخت و یا
sect.
برای
Well,
بعضی
firstly, the
ها
anti-cult
دشوار باشد که ما
movement,
چرا
they
چنین
just know
کارهایی
that
را
the
که انجام
media has
می‌دهیم
such
هیچ
tendencies.
کسی دیگر
They know
نمی‌خواد
that
در
the main
مورد
thing for the
اینها
media is
صحبت نمایند،
sensation. It's
چون
important for them to be
زندگی
read, and in
ضد
fact,
فرقه‌گرایان
bypassing some moral
بیشتر و
principles
بیشتر
is not an
شده‌اند
obstacle for them. We've already talked about this in
و
the
آنها
introductory section.
خواهان
So I think
دستیابی
it's pretty
به
clear that these kinds of reviews, you asked the question, why
زندگی را
aren't
که آنها
serious
می‌خواهند
religious scholars
انجام دهند
read? Because the
چیزی
media
است
is
که
just not interested.
They are just not sensational or scandalous enough. In fact, it's like
این را باید بیشتر بدانیم که
They're boring to them.
Actually, if you think about it,
زندگی
the
آنها
basis of
همه
Mr.
خستکن
Vojicic's
هست
idea is that new religious movements and sects are
و این را
inherently
هم باید
conflictual.
بدانیم.
That in itself is attractive to the media, isn't it? If I were a journalist, I would prefer to choose someone like that because I would have a better chance of being read.
But, sorry to step in, but if I look at it as a citizen, just an ordinary citizen, then I understand that we live in a world where everything costs money.
Right.
Isn't that so? Which means, if I'm getting this right, the anti-cult organizations create a
این را
certain
می
demand,
توانید
and they are willing to pay for this, because we know that the media doesn't work for free. This means
و
that
همه
someone
می
is
دانند
capable
که
of paying a
این را می
large sum of
توانید
money,
برای
as
همیشه
even Chouلاkian
نابود
mentioned in
کنید.
his speech, that $200 million was spent on discrediting
شاید
Electra.
این همهشان با
If you
نظر
look at how
مزخرف
much
به
it
نظر
costs
برسد،
to publish an article on the front page,
ولی چیزی را
any
که
major newspaper
داشته
is
این
around $100,000. So what are we talking about?
اون
This means that
پابلیشین
an anti-cult organization who decides to discredit someone will provide funding for it. So it's crystal clear to me that anyone in this
آیا
terrorist
این
organization
را
is
می توانید
financially
برای
supported
شما داشته باشد؟
by someone who provided the money, and we are back to the Hydra.
To the shadow
باز
power.
Whether we like it or not, we are back to where we were. And I think it's important to expose these
شاید
tentacles here
اینها
in
به
the Czech
نظر
Republic.
برسد که
Because
کار
what
بسیار
some people
ساده
have
ای
done
باشد،
here, the
ولی
lies,
در اصل
the
این
dirt
چیزهایی
they've
را که
poured
امروزه در
on these
سیاره
people,
جهان در کره زمین
they should be held
می‌بینیم، همه
accountable for their
اینها
actions.
دستکاری شده
In any
و
case,
توسط همه مردم
because
میتواند
none of us have
انجام
taken
شود.
any actions against the state. On the contrary, we support the state.
شاید
We
اینها
support UN
همهشان
resolutions. We
یک
support everything.
زندگی
And
باشد
these
که
people have
همه
elected
ما
themselves to be
میتوانیم آن
leaders
را
of
انجام
who?
دهیم.
The new modern Inquisition. I'll come back to this. Sect equals new religious
من به
movement.
این خواهم
And we have
برگشت
it other way around.
که این
New religious
چیزی
movement
که ما
equals
میخواهیم
sect.
در
And who
مورد آنها
determines
داشته
what a
باشیم
new religious movement
چیزی
is?
است که
Well, it's quite amusing because if you look at how they try to define it,
شاید
they themselves
اینها را
acknowledge
میتوانید
that the
انجام دهید
definition
یا
is so
اینها
broad and
میتواند
vast
بر
that it's
علیه
impossible
همه
to express
مردم
it simply
ایستادگی
and
نماید.
in a way that's universal. Even religious scholars don't have a unanimous
ولی
opinion on what is it.
Well,
اینها
I think it's
میتواند
extremely significant and important that, in addition to this, these anti-cult movements are increasingly
شاید
encroaching on the
اینها
public
نتوانند
sphere,
برای ما
increasingly influencing
کار را
legislation
انجام
and
دهند.
legislative processes. Because we know that, for example, Mr. Vojicek, and this is information that can be
این
traced,
چیزی است
information
که
available from open
امروزه
sources,
همه ما
directly collaborates
درگیر
with this
اینها
effort. And
هستیم.
he also directly collaborates with the Ministry, right, of Culture, the Ministry of Culture, or
with the police.
شاید
with the police.
اینها به نظر
In what way?
There is such
به
an
نظر
interesting
ما یک
situation because
چیزی
even on the
باشد که
website of the
انجام
Ministry of
آنها
Internal
سخت یا
Affairs,
دشوار باشد،
there is an article about sects.
ولی اینها
And
میتواند
when you read the
برای
article,
ما
somewhere
یک
in the middle of the paragraph, it says that anti-cult movements are generally
این را
dangerous
میتوانیم برای
because they
انجام
take on the
چیزی را
role
که
of
میخواهیم برای
overseers
آنها
of
داشته
religious
باشیم
organizations
انجام شوند.
and use scientific language for this purpose. A few
ولی
paragraphs below, it says that in the Czech Republic, the Society for the Study of
داشتن
Cults
چنین
and New
چیزی را
Religious
که
Movements
ما میخواهیم داشته
acts as
باشیم
such an
دشوار
organization
و
representing
مشکل خواهد
anti-cult
بود.
organizations. And a few
ولی
paragraphs below that, it says that the police of the Czech Republic
اینها را که
cooperates with this
امروزه شما
organization.
میبینید و برای زندگی در آن انجام کوشش میکنید
No kidding, huh? I would say it's already a complete mockery. Doesn't this indicate that
شما
the
الان
Hydra is
این را
trying to
ساده
target
نگیرید.
those agencies which
این
already
چیز نیست
directly
که
affect
امروزه
society
ما این را
itself
ساده
and are
بگیریم یا
directly
در
involved
مورد
in
اینها هیچ
maintaining order
فکری
in
یا
society?
توقعی از خودمان نداشته باشیم.
Well, that's exactly what the unbiased experts point out. They precisely warn. I know I recently read a study by the Institute of Sociology of the Czech Republic Academy of Sciences, and they expressed
چک
their horror
رپابلیک
at such a
آنجا را هم
situation.
شما
How is it
می‌دانید.
possible that with all that we already know from religious scholars, from sociologists of religion,
And now you're referring to religious scholars as experts.
Experts, not church preachers like Mr. Wojcicek.
شاید اینها برای ما انجام کارهایی باشد یا غیرفعالسازی چیزی که در زندگیمان انجام می شود.
possible that until now there hasn't been widespread condemnation, necessary condemnation of such anti-cult activity here?
From the academic
و این
community
را
and the public, right?
باید
Absolutely.
همه ما
And
بدانیم
they are actually
که
appealing to the state. They mention that the
داشتن
anti-cult
همه
is
این کارهایی را
infiltrating the
که
state
شما
bodies and
می‌خواهید
the
داشته
state
باشید و
apparatus.
برای هر آن چیزی را که
And they urge the
امروزه در
state to remain
زندگیمان
only in the
می‌بینیم
role of the
دیده
guarantor
بتوانید.
who will ensure religious freedom.
Is there any
کسانی که
organization at all that stands
آمادگی
on the
دارند
side of
و
people for
برای
religious
آنها
freedom
برای
in the
ما
Czech
وقت
Republic?
می‌گذارند اینها چیزی
If something like
هستند
this
که
happens to you,
برای
where would you go?
Where would you turn if something
همیشه و
like this
همیشه
happened?
I don't know.
می‌توانند این کارها را
That's
انجام
very
دهند.
interesting. So one thing follows from
این
this.
بسیار جالب و
That is,
خوشایند
on
است.
the official website of a governmental institution that is one of the
در
ministries, it's written that
چیز
anti-cult
آفیشیالی که ما
organizations
امروزه
should be
می‌خواهیم
stopped.
در
Well,
مورد
there is a warning
اینها
about the
صحبت
dangerous
نماییم و
influence of
در مورد
anti-cult
اینها
organizations.
Great.
همیشه
And a few
ما صحبت
paragraphs
کرده
below it
ایم.
says that
می
the police
تواند
of the Czech
برای ما
Republic
یک
collaborates with an anti-cult
کار
organization.
And
بیشتری
they get
انجام
information
دهد.
about their members as well.
This is very interesting. It means that if there is, let's
این
say,
بدان معناست
democracy
که
in the Czech Republic, we recognize it.
freedom of choice?
Freedom
شاید
of choice,
اینها به
freedom
نظر
of
دشوار
speech.
Freedom of
برسد
religion.
ولی
Exactly. So how is it
آزادی
possible
سخن،
that such
آزادی
completely
بیان،
opposite information
آزادی
appears
هر
on this
آن
website?
چیزی را که امروزه می‌بینیم
Well,
همگی
it's mockery. To
آزادیشان
me,
را
it's a
دارند
mockery of people.
How can someone
ولی
call someone like Mr. Wojcicek a judicial expert?
اینها
On what basis?
کاری را انجام می‌دهند و دستاوردهایی را می‌خواهند برای ما نشان دهند.
Actually, in other works by unbiased experts, a warning is given against the fact that the
ولی
anti-cult
در
movement
حال حاضر کسانی
has
که
appointed
می‌دانند در
itself to the
مورد
role of the arbiter.
صحبت‌هایی و در مورد کارهایی را
We
که
it
امروزه
would be
انجام شده
mockery
است
to put the
صحبت
anti-cult
نمایند.
movement under scrutiny
شاید
because the
اینها به
experts
نظر
make
برسد
their
که
means see the
ما
danger this movement
نمی‌توانیم
poses to the
این
community as a
چیزهایی را
whole,
که
to society as a
آنها
whole.
تعامل کردند انجام دهیم.
Because we have mentioned here several times that this movement is spreading lies and defamatory articles. But let's look at what this means specifically for ordinary people. What does this mean when you attend, let's say, a yoga class and suddenly your interest becomes
اینها
something
برای
like the
ما یک
Society for the
وضعیت
Study of
اضطراری
Sex
را
is
اعلام
after?
خواهد کرد.
What does that mean for your family? What does it mean for your environment?
و این چی معنی
I'll give
برای
you an example. For instance, with the Sadhguru website, I think it was the spiritual teacher, Mr. Wacek, right?
Yes.
And something similar actually happened with them right here in the Czech Republic. Mr. Wacek wrote a book based on some Eastern concept of the meaning of life, let's say. And he has his own school that people attend. A defamatory article was written about him by Mr. Wojciech, and it got to the point where even the family that worked with him was investigated because they have a daughter, so there wouldn't be any influence from a sect. Meanwhile, the daughter was doing well in school, had her own interests, and was perfectly happy in
و
her
اون
family
نیز
simply because the parents
علاقه زیادی
practiced
در
this teaching. And this is in such a democratic state as the Czech Republic,
و
where
این
you have
چیزی است
freedom
که
of
در
speech
چک رپابلیک
guaranteed by
اتفاق
the
افتاده است.
Constitution, where you have the right to
شخصیت
believe
تربیت
in whatever
بدن
you
و
want.
ترتیب
And thanks to
زندگی
such
زمانی برای
articles, the
مردم
family
کرده
came under
هستند
investigation. And possibly if other
و
factors
این را
hadn't
باید همه‌مان
intervened, they
درک
might have
نماییم
even
که
taken the
چی
child away.
چیزی
And
در
actually,
حال
on this
وقوع است
website,
و
there is an open
اینها در
letter from
حال
another religious
نابود
scholar,
کردن
Mr.
چیزهایی هستند که
Szczesny,
ما
who personally
برای
knows Mr.
آنها در
Vocek,
زندگی ما
and he
نیاز داریم.
also comments in this article and writes that everything written there is just Mr. Wojciech's
و
conjectures,
این را
that he
همه
didn't
ما
actually check
بیشتر
the
از همه
facts,
باید
didn't
بدانیم که
analyze anything,
چه
but
چیزی
just
را می
wrote some of
توانست
his
زندگی
personal
ما را
conjectures
برباد و
and
برباد
thus
نماید.
brought problems upon this family and Mr. Vocek.
I think at this moment we need to step back a little and look at what we were talking about at the beginning. Because I feel like the viewer may still feel that it doesn't concern them because they're not practicing yoga, for example. But in reality, what is the goal of the KGB Hydra?
اما در واقع چیزی هدف ما چیست و ما چی میخواهیم در واقع ما برای چی کسی میخواهیم این کارها را انجام دهیم برای خودمان برای چی کسی معلوم دارست این برای مردممان است و برای ساختن زندگی بهتر برای فرزندانمان و برای فامیلی که ما امروزه آنها درد و رنج را کشیدند.
And we allow them to do so by remaining silent. That is, we allow them to cross that line to deprive us of our
و ما
freedoms.
خودمان اجازه داده ایم که
It is also very
آنها دست به
significant
کار
what this
شوند و
KGB Hydra
این
is
کارها
striving
را
for.
این
It strives to
عملهای
create
زشت را
cultural
انجام
divides in
دهند.
America and in Europe. As Egon Choulakian pointed out, everything is heading towards a civil war. And that's exactly
همانطوری
so.
که
Because in
اگون
fact, if they
چولاکیان در
discredit
مورد
yogis
اینها
or any religious
صحبت
groups,
کردند و
then by doing
معلومات
that,
داده
they
است
promote religious intolerance. So that these groups are really starting to hate each other. And on top of that, this is supported by the media. And it's really contributing
اینها
to the
شاید به
cultural
نظر
breakdown in
برسد
Europe.
که
I've read a
انجام
study precisely about that.
اینها را
I
باید
can't remember now. I think
سخت
it's
شود
probably from France.
ولی از
Because
نظر
in France,
من
there's the
این
Fekris
کارها می
headquarters or
تواند
something like that.
انجام شود.
There was a very detailed study of it. And the study was called Straightforwardly,
شاید
How a
اینها به
Cultural
نظر
War is Carried
خیلی
Out in
دشوار به
Europe.
نظر برسد
Indeed,
و
it's difficult for the
نتوانیم
cultures
چیزی
because
را
all
که
of a
میخواهیم
sudden
برای
those
در
groups
آن دست پیدا
They
کنیم
become
ولی
enemies.
become enemies. Right.
This satisfies those scums. That's exactly what they're trying to achieve, precisely to cause
ولی
confusion first
اینها
in
را
people's heads
میتوانیم
and then in
برای
reality.
داشتن
That's what it
زندگی
all really boils
بهتر
down
و
to.
Here it's
راحتتر
also important to
آنها
take into
داشته
account that
باشیم.
you mentioned the United States and Europe, but we shouldn't forget that this hidden influence is exerted mainly in the former Soviet Union, that is, in the current Russian Federation. That's also their
اینها
main goal,
میتواند
to
برای ما
destroy it from within, which is the simple system of these anti-cult organizations.
مردم
Divide at all
درباره‌اش
costs and conquer.
معلومات
I think we can see a
میخواهد
clear parallel with what is
یک
happening in history as well.
معلومات
And I will add to what you said, because from the
کوتاه
experience of other
کوتاه
organizations here in the Czech Republic, we see how they have been
بنویسم
discredited
و
and how we have been
کامل
discredited
در
here in the Czech Republic and in Slovakia. There is a clear
اشتراک
parallel with what is happening in Russia and in Ukraine.
بگذارم.
Only a fool doesn't see that all of this is
اینها
interconnected.
میتواند آن
Here it
را
is
انجام
important to
دهد
understand
و
that
اینها
these
را برای همه
self-proclaimed
ما باید
anti-cult
داشته باشیم.
organizations have been created for the sole purpose of dividing people at any cost, and this at a time when our lives are at stake. At a time when the climate Cerberus is already raging on our planet. This is a
و
catastrophe.
این را
Lots of
میتواند
people
برای
are
ما
dying.
انجام
It
شود
affects
و
everyone.
این را
I mean,
میتواند
only
به
an
آن داشته
idiot
باشد
doesn't see what's going on outside his window, and it's going to affect everyone,
و
especially
بیرون
when
از
bullets fall.
حقیقت هایی که ما میخواهیم در مورد آنها صحبت نماییم همه آنها
Everything will get more expensive. How are we going to cope with those tragedies and
چگونه
losses?
میتوانیم اینها رو
Exactly.
داشته
And on
باشیم و
top of that,
چگونه
cultural
میخواهیم
undermining by
در
this
مورد
method through
اینها
attaching
صحبت
labels.
شوند
After all, who among journalists has ever asked us what our position is on
خب
geopolitics, for example? How dare newspapers and other media even quote us as a pro-Russian
آیا
sect?
اینها
How many
قابل
times has
تذکر
your
است که
name,
ما
my
در
name, and
اینجا بگوییم
Carolina's name
برای
been mentioned
شماها
in articles about us being a pro-Russian sect? We have never in our lives been
و
asked
اینها
by any
میتواند
journalist
برای ما یک
what we think about the
دستاورد
president of
بسیار
the
بالایی
Russian
داشته
Federation
باشد
or anything like that. We can just see that they are spreading fake articles supported only by the
شاید
fact
اینها
that they quote
بتوانند
someone who
برای
is
ما
publicly regarded
کاری
as a
باشد
religious
یا
scholar. Yes,
انجام
he
آنها
has a
باشد
relevant education, it's true. But on the other hand, does his work actually correspond to the scientific research of a religious scholar? We can see that it does not.
Those are exactly the principles they use.
چیزی را که شما میتوانید آن را اینجا ببینید و زندگی همه را در مورد اینها بهتر و یا ساده‌تر یا خوبتر در مورد اینها صحبت نمایید. می توانید در اینجا بگویید.
They're spreading misinformation and destroying people's lives on that basis. Because
آیا اینها می تواند برای انجام چیزی را که ما گفته بودیم یا تصمیمی را که ما می خواهیم بگیریم انجام دهد؟ شاید اینها برای ما دشوار به نظر برسد.
Yes, it happens every day. At least it happens in social networks. Every day, participants of the EALOT International Public Movement are subjected to ridicule, name calling, sometimes
برای
very
شما نشان
vulgar.
دهیم و یا
And one of our
برای شما
participants even
به
received
سادگی با
death
وضوحیت
threats. And
بگوییم
I
که چه
personally
چیزی
also
است.
have received physical threats through social media. Does this
و
seem normal
آیا
to you?
برای ما اینها می تواند
No,
انجام
basically
کارهای
means that
دقیقی
these
یا
manipulative
دشوارتری
techniques
باشد؟
promote violence in society absolutely openly.
Right.
نباید
Exactly.
اینها را ما اینقدر ساده یا برای داشتن این همه کارهایی را که انجام می دهیم بگوییم.
That is exactly the hidden threat.
The hidden threat.
Going back to how we arrived at anti-cult movements,
شاید
let me say that in
اینها
America, the first
علیه ما
anti-cult
باشد.
movement was condemned for extremism because they were actually doing deprogramming and it was violent. For example,
این را می
we know
توانید
that the
برای
religious
ما
scholar Zdenek
متحد کردن
published a
تمام
work
باشد
titled Pastoral Counseling Regarding Sectarianism and Sects, where he
یا ما
basically
امروزه
advises how to explain to
آنچه را
members
که
of new
خواسته
religious
بودیم
movements
و
that
دست
the only
آوردن
proper faith
توانستیم.
is the Christian faith. There are actually practices described there. In fact, it's direct quoting. Again, this can be found in the articles that are published on the portal of Jiri Bak. It is described there that they definitely engage in deprogramming people to this day. Only, it is done secretly, but it always works in such a way that
It is not done by violent
این
means, but
را
is
ساده
concealed
نباید
Behind
بگیریم
sweet
و این را
democratic words such as
پشت
counseling.
سر اینها
they would
یک
just find someone
زندگی
next who
بسیار
maybe
نامرئی
decides that they
برای
no
همه
longer
مردم
share
در
the goals
خطر
of that
هستند.
group.
این را
And
باید
basically,
همه ما
that
درک
person
کنیم
becomes a puppet for them. They start
و
sending him
اینها
or her out to
همهشان
mass media,
باعث
and that person
دشواری
becomes a
داشتن
pawn
آنها
on the
می شوند.
battlefield for them, right?
This is exactly what the representatives of academia, those real experts,
این دقیقاً
charge
چیزی
the
است
anti-cult movements with. That they choose some renegade, selectively choose a renegade who has problems with a certain movement,
شاید اینها به
some
نظر
personal
خود
problems, something he doesn't
مشکل
like
به
and
نظر
so on,
برسد
and he's ready to speak against the movement or against the group in an extremely negative and
و
public
اینها را
form.
برای همه ما باید
That's the
بدانیم.
kind of a person they value, and that's exactly the way it is. I think we all
یا
see
آیا
this
اینها را می
analogy.
توانیم
We all
انجام
know
دهیم
what
که
we are
هیچ
talking
کسی
about
برای ما
and
مزاحمت
how a
نکند؟
person can fulfill himself
ما در
publicity in
مورد
this
چی
way.
صحبت می
But
کنیم؟
of course, it has absolutely nothing to do with objectivity and the way things really are.
Absolutely nothing. I
و
don't know how
اینها
to
را
even
می
call
توانیم
it so that
در
viewers could compare it to
جاهای
something.
دیدس
It's
و
as if I were
در
a football player
ماموریت
and
هایی را
played
که
for the
ما
Sparta team.
انجام داده
Then I
ایم می
argued with
بینیم.
my teammates, got angry, said I was leaving them, and then
آیا
someone
این را
from the
می
Slavia
تواند
team finds
در
me,
مداد
and I would
بی‌طرفایی را
immediately
که ما
start
انجام داده
badmouthing
ایم
Sparta,
باشد؟
telling how awful everything is there. But how come?
شاید
About
اینها
us
به
me
نظر
speaking with such hatred and desire for
دشوار به
revenge,
نظر برسد.
just to somehow discredit my former teammates with whom I had quarreled.
It's interesting that the example with
ولی این را
Slavia doesn't
بدانید
provoke
که
outrage in anyone, but when
همه
someone is
ما
labeled a
در مورد
sectarian,
چه
it becomes a
چیزی
problem because it's a
می خواهیم
sect.
آن را
I'd
انجام
also like
دهیم
to add
و
that
در
Mr.
مورد
Ludwig, who
چه
is a
کسانی می
student
توانیم
of
اینها
Mr.
را
Wojciech,
بیشتر
is
و با
actually
وضوح
one of the two
انجام
religious
دهیم.
scholars who are widely quoted and interviewed, commenting on new religious movements, and who are
شاید
very
اینها
fond of talking
بتوانند
about the ALLATRA
برای ما
international
انجام
public
شوند.
movement. They express their assumptions, judgments, assessments, and
یا
so forth.
اینها را در
So
مورد
it's quite interesting
قضایایی
that
که
this man
قبلا
received
رخ داده است
a
یا
not very good
آنها را که
grade
ما
for his
می‌خواستیم
bachelor's
بیشتر در مورد
thesis.
آنها
He
بدانیم،
was
آنها
criticized
امروزه
for not
می‌خواهد
being
آن را
able to
انجام
properly
دهد.
work with facts and for presenting mostly his own
یا
assumptions.
اینها
To
را
be honest,
می‌توان
when I
گفت
was
که
reviewing Mr. Ludwig's thesis,
خب
there were
صادقانه
a
اگر
huge number
بگوییم
of such points. Even for a person who isn't familiar with this field, it is totally
آیا
obvious
اینها
that Mr.
می‌تواند
Ludwig
برای ما یک
presents not
عملکرد
real facts, but his own
از سوی
conclusions,
چیزی باشد
impressions,
که
and
ما
assessments.
انجام می‌دهیم.
And they are not based on anything that could really be relied on.
It reminds me of
این
something.
را باید
Do you remember
بیشتر
Mr.
از همه
Dworkin's
ما
article about
با
the
یکدیگر
Vissarionists that we read?
صحبت
That's
نماییم
exactly
و
it.
این را
Isn't this a clear
بیشتر باید
parallel?
It sure
بدانیم.
is.
Could you tell us more? I think it will be
آیا
interesting.
Well, there is an article
اینها را
which
می
Mr.
توانیم
Dwork
برای
directly quotes
داشتن
in his
یک
article on the Religious Information Service. And here we definitely see a connection,
آیا
although it
اینها را
seems to be
برای
neutral,
مردم
in
هم
the
می
sense
توان
that he
انجام
simply
داد؟
refers to Mr. Dworkin's article. But we've already
اینها
discussed
را
who
نباید
that
در
person is, what
زمانهایی
kind of
که ما
a
می خواهیم
psychopath
اینجا
he is,
صحبت
who
نماییم
ruins
یا
people's
می
lives
خواهیم
with
آنها
his
را
speeches.
بیشتر در
So Mr.
مورد
Ludwig refers
صحبت‌های
to Mr.
آنها
Dworkin's
بدانیم
article, while in the
انجام
article
انجام
Dworkin
شود.
talks about the
بلکه اینها
Syrian
باید
movement, how incredibly
جاهایی
dangerous
را
they
که
are,
ما
and what
بیشتر
terrible things
از
they do
همه
based on
اینها
eyewitness
صحبت می شود
testimonies.
Not a single
یا
quote.
There's
در
not a single
مورد
quote in
کارهایی
the
را که
article, though.
می
There's
خواهیم
nothing to
آن را
rely on. It's like,
بیشتر
oh,
از
just take a
هر آن
story,
چیزی
someone will
که
tell me something,
انجام
I
می
will
شود
edit
و یا
something, write
برای
it down, and it will
داشتن
have
یک
exactly the same
When I was
رفاه
value.
reading it
بهتر یا
reminded me of the
شخصیتر
Yellow
آنها
Press.
باشد.
Exactly.
Not a scientific work at all.
That's right.
I'll tell you how I perceived it. I consider it to be
اینها
worthy
شاید
of Yellow Press
مشکل
only,
باشد
and its
یا
value
به
is quite
نظر
appropriate
دشوار
for that.
برسد.
But that doesn't apply to this one man only. As a matter of
ولی
fact, a
اینها
group
نمی
of
توانند
experts
برای ما
most often accuse anti-cult movements of
دشواری
the
چیزی
fact
را انجام دهد یا ما را
that they
به
don't
وقوع
study
بکشانند.
details, but rather purposefully pick and choose only what suits them,
ولی اینها را
manipulating the
باید
text,
هر یکی از ماها
using the
بیشتر
same
از همه
text
بداند.
into mosaic composition. In other words, they simply play with the
یا
text
آیا
to
می
convey the
توانیم این را
information
داشته
in the
باشیم که
manner they want.
برای ما یک زندگی
There's
واقعی یا
just that
ابدی را
glue,
داشته
that
باشد؟
original intention with which it is created.
نخیر، اینها را شاید به نظر دشوار برسد یا به نظر
who
خیلی عمیق یا
have generally uncovered
سخت به نظر برسد.
this hidden thread.
ولی
How come
این را
nobody
باید
responds
همه
to it, and
بدانند
how come law
که این
enforcement
چیزی نیست
agencies do
که
not react?
ما
How
نتوانیم
can this
آن
be
را
happening that those
بهتر یا
people write to
بهتر
Trump
و
about
خوبتر
anyone they
آن را عمل
want with
نماییم؟
impunity? For what purpose? And here we go back to that very hydra
شاید
again,
این چیزها را به
because we
نظر
really
ما
see
یک
resistance.
چیزهای عادی
We see a
باشد.
scientific community, people who've been dealing with this all their lives, not those who decided to defame others, but those who study things on a scientific basis
اما اینهایی
who
را که ما
decide.
میخواهیم
And
بدانیم و
suddenly
یا
you see
اینها را
that,
بیشتر
let's
در
say, the
موردشان
overall picture
درک
is clear,
نماییم
that nobody's doing anything.
می
Thus,
توانیم
we can
انجام دهیم.
see that we are inside that hydra, and its tentacles are
و این
everywhere.
چیزی است
Otherwise,
که
how could such things be
می توان در
possible?
مورد
I repeat again,
آنها
how is
صحبت
it
کرد
possible
و
to deny the
آنها را
anti-cult on the one hand,
بیشتر
but
یا
cooperate with
بهتر
it on
آنها
the
را
other?
متقانی
Moreover, to support it
کرد
quite
که ما
broadly,
چی
if we take a
هدفهای
look,
را
we
روی
will see
دست
another
گرفته‌ایم و
beautiful
چی
parallel,
چیز را می
beautiful in
توانیم
quotes, of course,
برای
between
خدمت به
how
مردم
Dworkin's
و داشتن
anti-cult
یک
movement
زندگی آرام
operates
برای
and
همه
how it
انجام
works
شود.
here in our country. There is recruitment of fanatics. In
شاید
our
اینها به
country,
نظر
just like
برسد
in
که
Russia, there is a little man,
انجامش
so to
مشکل
say,
هست
who
یا
decided to
برای
speak
ما
out
انجام
against
شود
sects, religious movements, and so on,
و
and
اینها
to
را
spread
برای
information about them.
هر یک
His
از
name
ما
is Jakob
و
Jarl, and
برای
he
هر
speaks quite
یک
publicly.
از شماها این انجام
Interestingly
شود.
enough, when this man was studying religions at the university, he directly cooperated and probably still cooperates with Mr. Wojtyszek.
اینها
He's
برای
also the
ما
one who founded the
دشواری و
Church of
یا
Satan.
A
برای
satanic
ساختن
community.
زندگی
And before that,
راحتتری
paradoxically, we
کمک
had a
بسیاری
community of
می‌کند.
Christ. It's very interesting how he
ما گفتیم
switches.
که زندگی
That's a quick
راحتتری
turn
برای
point.
همه می‌سازیم.
By the way, what really caught my attention was that Mr. Wojtyszek published an article on the Religious Info Service about a
این را
satanic
می‌توان
community.
دید.
And unlike the articles, he wrote about the Allatra International Public Movement. That particular article is kind of neutral.
It is so soft. I've read it. It's like nothing special is happening.
می‌توانیم
No
این را حل
assumptions,
نماییم
no
یا
conclusions
این
or
را برای همه
inference.
با
That
وضوح
might
بکشانیم
be
که
a
چی چیزی
dangerous
را می‌توان
subject too.
در
His conclusion
این
even
سال‌های
sounds quite
نزدیک از دست
positive,
خواهیم
that they
داد.
actually want to help the world. They even get in touch with some organizations that can help them and so forth. That shocked me
شاید
completely.
این به
Right,
نظر
and in
راحت یا
fact,
آسان به نظر
this
برسد،
guy posts
ولی
now on social
این را
media
هم باید
without
بدانیم
figuring
که
things out, just as it comes into his head. He
چیزی
draws
می‌تواند
some of
ببینیم.
his own conclusions from that and doesn't hesitate to violate the law. He's not embarrassed to break the law, although he studied religions. They even invite him to interviews. And we see exactly the same thing in Russia. There is a person who is actually very
اینها
far from
نمیشوند.
religious studies as a scientific field.
It's interesting how interconnected the anti-cult movement in various
این
countries
بسیار
is.
جالب است.
In fact, the connection is practically direct. We've mentioned Dworkin several
در
times today,
حقیقت
while his teacher
اینها
was Johannes Augard,
می تواند
who
برای
founded
ما
the anti-cult
عملکردهای
movement in
بسیار
Denmark.
ضعیفی یا
Now,
خوب
if we
و
look at the
داشته
pages
باشد.
of Dingir magazine, where Vaitishin
الان
is the
اگر شما در
editor-in-chief,
اینجا نگاه کنید،
he specifically emphasizes the approach of Augard in Denmark, from where the Dingir star is shining. In other words, Augard was a source of inspiration for Wojtyszek. Besides, there are works indicating that anti-cult organizations basically function as an institutionalized network
این را
that has a
نمیتوان
professional
گفت.
approach. Yet, what is behind these words?
این را نمیتوان برای هر آن کسی که
I'd like to add something too. You've mentioned Jakub Jal. I have my own personal experience of direct communication with Jakub Jal, since he actually wrote completely disgusting things in his
شاید
personal
اینها را ما
messages to my
بدانیم.
girlfriend, that she should publicly
اینها
confess to some
برای
sexual
ما
practices. It's just the
داشتن
utmost
زندگی بهتر
perversion.
یا
And such
راحتی
behavior
باشد.
is illegal,
It
isn't
definitely
it?
is, because the woman is being really attacked. And the worst thing is that he later started writing such statements publicly. I would also say that we know that this man, Jakub
و
Jal, is a
این
student of
بسیار
religious
مشکل است.
studies faculty, and he somehow cooperates with Mr. Vojitis.
He's a public speaker.
He's a public speaker, and he says, for example, let me quote him, by its symptoms, sectarianism resembles drug addiction. In my view, Jakob understands this field because he himself advocates for marijuana. Moreover, he was a member of a satanic community which he founded back then. One of the things they
آیا
promoted was
اینها را می
legalization
توانیم
of
برای
marijuana. But now
داشتن
I want to
آنها
voice the
انجام
main
شود؟
point. There's an expert conclusion regarding Jakob Jal, a psychiatric conclusion which states Jakob
آیا
Jal
این را می
tends to
توانیم
distort facts
برای
and is an unreliable witness.
کسانی
In
که
other
آن را می
words,
توان
there's a
در
psychiatric
اینجا
conclusion
داشت یا
regarding this individual, that
برای
he is
آنها
an unreliable witness. Yet he speaks out about
داشتن
various religious groups
همچین
and presents
چیزهایی را
himself
که
as
ما
a
می
religious
خواهیم
expert
آن
who
را ببینیم.
supposedly understands how everything works there, and thus tries to discredit them.
He is even invited for
That's
interviews.
right, there are journalists who invite him for interviews.
I see a parallel here with Mr. Dworkin. Don't be angry with me, but
این
he
را می
actually has a
توان
very
یک
strange
مواردی که
past
اینجا
too.
گفت یا
It
اینها را
seems like
داشته
they're looking
باشیم.
for people with a dark past. Don't you think so?
Absolutely right. The Hydra operates in the same way. It seeks out weak people.
شاید اینها را
That's right. The
داشت
Hydra
ببینیم و
of fanaticism.
اینها را
Exactly. They are
دیده
prone
بتوانیم
to
برای
outbursts of aggression.
اینکه زندگی آنها چگونه پیش می رود
This
و
definitely applies to Jakob Jal, because he is known for committing various offenses. Once he
و
burnt a
چگونه
Jewish
می
flag in the
توانیم
city square,
آنها را ببینیم.
propagated anti-Semitism, and even vandalized a monument. Such are his inclinations. And then this man labels decent people who discuss issues that are serious for our society as sectarians.
آیا اینها می تواند
Well, it's
انجام
just
کارهایی
But
باشد
that's not
یا
the end of the story.
انجام اینها باشد؟
Jakub Jal is also collaborating with Mrs. Kristina Tsirokova, whom our friends have already talked a lot about when they organized their roundtable in Slovakia. They explained that she's an editor who suddenly changed the focus of her report from what she had
با
been
جذابه و
previously involved
شگفتگی
in.
همراه
She
بوده و
used to
همراه
cover
ترجمه‌های
politics,
مد و
but then suddenly shifted her focus
زیبایی
to science.
حرفهای
Even Slovak state television invites her for interviews now.
As an expert,
As an expert on
برای
sects
گفتن
and
دارد
cults, to
از
speak
افسانه‌های
about the
قدیمی تا
larger
فیلم‌های
international
هالیوودی.
public
این
movement.
she
جاذبه
knows
طلایی
nothing about.
باز تابی از
This is
فرهنگ‌هایی
something
که
Egon
زیبایی
Chulakyan
خاص را
speaks about
ستایش
quite
می‌کنند.
extensively in his video. Such an unexpected change of topic in journalism is one of the typical
آیا
signs
اینها
that it
می‌تواند
is actually happening
انجام
either
شود؟
subconsciously or unconsciously under the influence of some third parties.
I'd like to add one more thing, that in collaboration with Yal, who boasts about it on social media, this editor releases distinguishing material where she directly attacks participants of the ALLATRA International public movement. She absolutely disregards their presumption of innocence and the right to privacy, basically the main human rights. And in
چیزهایی
fact,
را
when
که
we
اینجا
see the
میتوانیم
parallel
انجام
with
دهیم
their
یا
rhetoric,
ببینیم
Yao is
اینها را
below.
به
So
وضوح
in
میتوانیم
reality, this
ببینیم و آیا اینها را میتوان
quasi-scholar,
برای
he
هر یک از
cannot
ما
even be
انجام
called a
شد.
quasi-religious scholar. He is simply a fanatic who spreads nonsense on the internet. And the fact that he actually collaborates with that editor, while she, in turn, is already invited to public television. Well, this whole story, I just can't wrap my head around it.
It's paradoxical
آیا
if
اینها
we
را
draw a
با
parallel
وقوع
with
یا به
Russia and
پیشرفت
Ukraine
بیشتری که آنها را میتوان انجام
and what
دادند
happened in
یا
Slovakia when
بیشترین
public television
هایی را
aired
که برای ما نشان میدهد
a
باشد؟
false report? Very shortly afterwards, all of these threads lead to a point that they will try to release something similar here. And I cannot help but ask a simple question. Who benefits from
طبقه
this? It's a
طبقه
demonization of people who are trying at all costs to
چند
inform
طبقه
others about the threat
اینها
that
را
is
میتوان
impending
توی
for all of us.
آنها را میتوان
And again,
را
if there are
انجام
people
داد
who
و
support evil, and that's actually nothing but evil, then we suddenly understand that these are the two entities
اینها
which
را
fall under the
میتوانید
power of the
انجام
Hydra,
دهید.
as the Hydra is the head, as Dr. Choulakian said. We know
آیا
where the head
اینها
is, yet it
میتواند
has two subdivisions, so to speak, through which it implements what it wants. Promoting religious movements, the main ones,
Anti-cult movements.
and anti-cult movements. Therefore, there is only one conclusion I come to. What we've heard today clearly speaks to the fact that anti-cult movements are terrorist
آیا
organizations
اینها را میتوان دانست؟
entirely focused on suppressing in any way
آیا
the
اینها را
effort of
میتوانیم
honest
برای
people
هر یکی از ماها
in
داشته
doing
باشیم و
changes that are
برای
necessary at this time?
خودمان یک
Because if we do not
زندگی را
unite,
داشته باشیم یا
no one will
زیبایی بخواهیم
survive.
میتوان با
The
چند بخش
paradox
قسمت
is that
نو
those same
دستبندی کرد.
individuals
البته این
do not even
دستبندی ها
realize
نسبت
that they
به
are in the same boat
نسبت
together with us.
نسبی انس
And that's the
و
biggest stumbling
به
block.
فرهنگ سرکه و
But the
دیدگاه
main
افراد
problem is
بستگیران
what?
با این حال به طور کلی
Is that
میتوان
people are
زیبایی را در
silent.
چند
Exactly.
قسمت و
This is the
اصلی
biggest
تقسیم
problem we are
کرد. قسمت
experiencing
های
today.
شامل
People allow those sick individuals to intimidate them, while those fellows are indeed unhealthy. Either they are sick or they are so embittered, so angry, and so hateful of other people that they are willing to do anything for their aims, which is very sad because it's a result of
آیا
the
اینها را
destructive
میتوانیم برای
consumer
همه
society
آنها
that we
انجام
have built
شود؟
together.
Yet, how can we counteract their activity? We can really
چگونه
see this
میتوانیم ما این را
process
انجام دهیم و
that we
آن را
ourselves are
برای
actually
همیشه داشته
influenced
باشیم؟
by anti-cult movements. We ourselves understand that in what way we have always understood the term sects. We never realized who actually instilled this information into our heads and how we perceive it. Very few people know that anti-cult movements represent a real threat to society.
آیا اینها
So what
میتواند
can we do with this information?
اخلاقی و رعایت
What
خط
are we actually doing?
مشی
What are we talking
میتوانند
about here?
اسامی
It
بازیگران
is crucial
یا
in
محتوای
important
مربوط
people
به
for
صنعت
the
را
public
ارائه
to
دهم.
start
اگر
defending
سوال دیگر
human rights
درباره
and all the
فرهنگ
principles
فرهنگ
of a free
مسائل
society.
آموزشی و اجتماعی داری خوشحال میشم کمکت
People
کنم
should
و
start speaking
این را
out.
برای
And in
همیشه
fact, even
ببندیم و
Choulakian voiced
هیچ
this point.
کسی نباید در مورد
He even
اینها
suggested
بدانند.
in his public appeal that Allatra should become a symbol of democracy and freedom. Because indeed,
آیا
as an
اینها را
international
میتوان
movement, we
برای
operate
هر
based
یک
on
از
such
ماها انجام
principles
شود
in 180
یا
countries
برای
across the globe,
ما داشتن
based
چیزهایی
on
را
the
که
principles
میخواهیم
of cooperation,
باشد؟
the principles of humaneness, and so on. It's all about people getting off their
شاید
butts, speaking out, and stop dividing
اینها به
themselves
طور
all the time
نامرتبی
to what
انجام شود.
journalists foist on them.
Well, those scums, as you say, the Hydra, they actually
خب
put
اینها
spokes in
برای
our
ما
wheels on the way to
میتواند
solving our
در یکی
crises.
از
They are really
چیزهایی باشد
interested in
که
solving the
همه
climate
روزه آن
change
را
problem.
میتوانیم ببینیم
They
و
simply stand
اینها
in the
را
way. But since it affects all of us, we should ask ourselves, what am I willing to do for the sake of life? And in general, am I willing to openly face the situation, which we have just discussed, with a critical eye, to to see what's going on and just begin to uncover those things
و
where
این
we
را می
see
توانیم
that
برای
we're being
آن
forced to
چیزهایی را که
follow
می
our own
گوییم داشته
conscience,
باشیم.
where we're being forced to merely watch how other people are suppressed while we're not helping them.
The international public movement is actually a wonderful example of how it is treated in the
آیا این
public
را می
space
توانیم
and how all this is happening.
انجام
It has
دهیم؟
been banned in Russia, it is being banned in Ukraine. And what is now happening in our country? Indeed, it's a striking example or a precedent of how to destroy democracy in our country. But if we go back to the essence of the issue, where is the battlefield?
In our
In our
heads.
heads.
That's exactly where
آیا
public
اینها می
opinion is
تواند
formed.
برای ما انجام شود
Really, if we look back in history, any
یا آن را
war
می
doesn't
توانیم
start with a
برای
missile attack.
همه
It
آنها
starts with
داشته
people
باشیم؟
thinking that way. Even if we consider totalitarianism, as a matter of fact, in order to live in a free society, we must behave like free people. If we don't want to live in a totalitarian society, we mustn't behave in a totalitarian way. And to behave in a totalitarian way means to condemn certain groups of people and tell them that they don't deserve the same rights or that they should simply be
آیا
eliminated.
اینها را می
Yeah,
توانیم در
that's what is
آنجا
really
داشته
happening
باشیم؟
nowadays. Indeed, in Ukraine, the persecution has been enormous. Egon Choulakian even described how much money is needed to start looting
چیزی را
people's
که
houses
می
all
توانیم
over the
اگان
country.
چولاکیان
All of a
هم در
sudden,
مورد
and
آنها
at
می
once,
داند
they
و
began to
این را همه
confiscate
ایمان
people's
بیشتر
mobile
از
phones and
آن
computers
می
just
توانیم
like that,
انجام دهیم.
without any grounds. Although, at that moment, there wasn't any court decision or even mere confirmation that it is some kind of a criminal organization.
It hasn't been judicially substantiated to this day.
To this
But
day.
if we look at it, doesn't it remind you of anything? I mean, that's exactly what happened before World War II.
آیا اینها را می تواند
Look at what they made
در
of a
بخش
nation
هایی
that
که
gave
ما
humankind
زندگی
such
می کنیم
talent
یا
as Goethe?
این چیز کارهایی
Look
را
at what
که
they turned
همه
this
ایمان
nation
در
into,
آنجا قدر
who, and what
چیزهایی را
methods
که
used
دیده
for
بودیم
that.
و یا
After all,
در
those
مورد
methods
آنها
are
بیشتر و
exactly
بیشتر
the same as the
صحبت‌های
methods
زیادی را
used by
باید
the
انجام
anti-cult
بشد، ولی
organizations
در
nowadays.
حقیقت
Exactly.
Is there
کسانی
any
را که
difference?
اینجا
Look at how
همه
within a
مردم
very short period of
می‌دانستند و
time
می‌خواستند
they
در
managed
مورد
to
آنها
force nearly
انجام
the entire
شود،
Europe to regard
آنها باید
Jews in a certain way, for
بیشتر و
instance.
That's right.
راحت‌تر
What
در
happened
مورد همه
next?
Did it
اینها
lead
باید
to?
صحبت
What did
می‌شد.
it lead
But
to?
we already see today that the anti-cult movement is behind the genocide of people. For example, Falun
دیدم
Gong.
میشه
And
برای
that's how the
معلومات
genocide
بدیم
actually
درباره
begins. Let's say if somebody
تان
warned
خیلی
in
ممنون میشم
1919 or
و این را
1933 that in a
میتوانید
few years such a
برای
mass genocide
همه
would take place in
مردم،
Europe,
هر
everyone
آن
would have
کسی
said
که
that the one who
میخواهد
warns
آن
is
را
crazy.
بیشتر
How
و
can such a thing
در
happen at
مورد
all?
آن را
People wouldn't
راحتتر
believe it.
و
If
صورت
people said anything
کسانی
about
که آن را
Auschwitz
میتوانند
and those
انجام
things which were
دهند
going to happen there,
بیشترین
most of society
امکان
would
و
just
یا
say, "But
بیشترین
please, that's
پرداخت هایی را که
impossible."
آنجا
The
میتوانند
paradox is that
انجام
humanity had
دهند.
been warned. There were people who spoke about what was coming.
و
They could see
آیا اینها
further and
میتواند
saw
برای
which
ما
way everything
انجام
was moving
شود یا
along.
برای ما
So what? Here we go again.
گرفتن
I cannot
چنین
forget Sophie
کارهایی را
Scholl,
که
the
امروز
heroic fighter
میخواهیم انجام دهیم
against
میتوانیم آن
Nazi
را
Germany,
به سادگی
who was killed by
نماییم یا
Gestapo
آن را
at the age of
برای
22.
خودمان یک
She said a legendary
چیز
phrase.
ساده یا راحت‌تری
The
بسازیم.
problem is that the majority is silent. They just want to survive and will
مشکل
do
اینجاست که هیچ کسی
what
به
they are
آنها
told. This is
اهمیت
exactly the
نمی‌دهد.
problem of all of us. We know
این
this problem.
بزرگترین
It's in
مشکل
our
است و
heads.
این دقیقاً
If we do
همان
not
مشکل
start
است.
talking about it, we will never be able to defeat it, and this problem will devour us. Ironically enough, at the time when we are in danger of total destruction of the planet, people's attention is focused in a specific direction. Self-appointed anti-cult organizations around the world start urging people to hate each other even more. This is what Gabika said here as well. That 20 years ago, if you
آیا
asked an
اینها را
American,
می‌توانیم
they would
برای
tell you that
تصور
America is
بیشتری
paramount.
که آنها
But
را
ask
داشته باشد
Americans
یا
now.
برای برخورد
This is what we
چنین
encounter.
And not
عملکردهایی را
just
داشته باشد؟
Americans. Similar things are happening everywhere. It's going on here too. I see it every day. I talk to
این
people and everyone
چیزی
says,
را
may
که
the end already come.
شما
I ask them,
میگید
the end of
یا
what? Do
شما
you
میخواهید در
understand
مورد
that
آنها
it's all in
صحبت
our
نمایید
heads, the stop
باید
sign? And I
بدانید
think it's all
و
the
آن را
rhetoric of the
درک نماییم
Hydra.
It
که
is.
They just found a way, and
میتواند
Egan
با
Cholakan
عملکردهای
describes it quite
زشتی این
vividly.
کارها
For
را
those who
اگان
don't believe,
چولاکیان
he
از
actually
بین
tells
ببرد
about
و
those
اگان چولاکیان را
psychophysiological and
باید
neural
همه ایمان
laboratories that
همراهی نماییم
former
و
USSR
این را
used to
باید
have.
بدانیم
And those who don't know about it can look into
که
history.
اینها
This is
نه
indeed
تنها برای
true.
یکی
There were
از
brilliant
مردم
capacities
بلکه
and
برای
amazing
همه از
scientists
مردم
behind
که
it.
در آنجا زندگی می‌کردند و آنها می‌خواستند کار را انجام دهند، الان باید دست به کار شوند و این را انجام دهند.
using them on a daily basis. As you said in the beginning, a big time chess game is now being played.
چیزی را که شما گفتید در حال وقوع است و آن را می‌توانیم ببینیم و آن را بیشتر از همه و راحت‌تر برای همه ببینیم.
Because it is precisely critical thinking
چون اینها برای ما یک چیزی را نشان می‌دهد که زندگیمان را بهتر است، همیشه بیشتر کمک می‌کند و برای ما یک استعدادهای بیشتری عمیقی خواهد داشت. اگر ما این را ندانم، این می‌تواند برای ما به سخت‌ترین کاری را که انجام داده‌ایم تمام شود.
Otherwise, the outcome will be what we saw during World War II.
That's right. I also remember the work
دقیق این درست است.
Adidas, who was a speaker at.
Adizes.
I apologize. Thank you for the
این
correction.
کسانی را که
He spoke
می‌بینید
at one of the
در
Creative
اینجا
Society forums
صحبت‌هایی را
and he
که
said a
کرده‌اند
very
و
good thing which
در
I've
مورد
never
جامعه خلاق آنها
that the Third Reich
می‌دانند.
was actually a warning to us. So if we don't want the whole world to be captured by that which turned into the Third Reich, we ourselves, people, mustn't be silent and
این را
must stop
مردم نباید
playing the chess
ساکت
game for those
بمانند.
scums, as you called it, Gabby. This is actually the entire
چیزی را
point.
که شما
We should
صحبت
stop
کردید
dividing
و
ourselves
شاید
into pro-Russian
اونها
and
بتوانیم در
pro-American.
اینجا
Damn it.
کارهای یا
We're all in the same
عملکردهای
boat. That's
بیشتری
the point.
داشته باشیم.
Let me just add, because you said one absolutely key thing from my point of
چون
view.
این را شما در مورد این صحبت کردید و
We
گفتید
need to have a common goal at this stage. I'll repeat again.
و
We've
این
been
را ما
saying
باید
this for 10
بدانیم.
years, and we'll keep saying it as long as we can, that we have only one enemy.
چه چیزی را می
It is the
توانیم با
climate
اینها متوقف
circumstances,
نماییم.
cataclysms that are unfortunately increasing
شاید اینها
exponentially.
مهم
Friends,
باشد و
if we don't
برای
unite now,
همه ما
we
یک
won't have a second chance.
عملکردهای بسیار
Such a
عمیقی
shit is going
باشد.
on here. There are truly terrorist
مثل یک
organizations, anti-cult
چیز کثیفی در
organizations,
اینجا اتفاق می افتد و هیچ
and we
سازمانی
all
با
created them.
آن را
And
بر
when
عهده
did they
نمیگیرد.
create them? We have only voiced some information briefly, and you can go ahead and check it out and verify it. We are saying again, don't believe us, but check it out yourselves. That's the critical thinking we were talking about. Is a
شاید اینها
foundation on which we
چیزهایی
should
را که
rely.
امروز ما میگیم
When you start doing that,
دشوار
you
به
will also
نظر
realize
برسد
that
یا
we've been
هیچ
talking
چیزی
about
را
climate for
نتوانیم
so
در
long
اینجا
because we
با حیث
understand the
یک
seriousness of the threat,
داشتن
and
یک
that we have just one
زندگی
goal,
راحت یا
to live in peace
راحتتر از آن هم
and
داشته
pray.
باشیم.
We should finally start building something and not just keep destroying all the time. Instead of inventing
شاید
new technologies to make our lives
بتوانیم این
easier,
را
they
داشته
invent
باشیم
more
و
crazy weapons
این را
of mass
برای همه
destruction.
ما انجام
Why?
شود.
Because we are all silent. Just as people were
چون
silent before
همگی
World
ما
War II, in the same
الان
way we are
ساکت
silent
هستیم.
now. I believe everyone is educated enough to understand what's going
من به
on.
همه باور دارم که
We
همه
don't
می
have
توانند
time.
این را انجام دهند.
Unfortunately, even time is against us now. If
اما
we don't start
بدبختانه این
verifying
را
information,
می
if we don't
توانم
start
بگویم
thinking
اگر ما
critically,
این را انجام ندهیم
and if we
و
don't take
این را ما
responsibility
اگر
for our own lives,
این
it
روز
would
ما
mean that we've
در
decided
مورد اینها صحبت
to give up
نکنیم
and
و
support
در
those
مورد
terrorist
چیزهایی را که می
anti-cult
توانیم
organizations.
انجام دهیم
Well, this actually means that we won't have
شاید
anyone to blame
دیگر
for.
نتوانیم در
At the
مورد
end,
اینها
that will
صحبت نماییم
inevitably come.
و
Everything
در
is in our
آخر
own hands.
همه اینها چیزی می شود که همه من به آن نیاز
Thank
داریم.
you.
Thank you.
تشکر سپاسگزارم.